The story begins on the 4th floor of the Cork Island dungeon. Peak Sword, ranked 16th in the unified rankings, leads a team of 8 top rankers and 200 elite members of the Silver Knights Guild. There are only 5 minutes left, and with this team, they would be able to capture a small fortress. However, Pixword is very nervous. On this 4th floor, a monster boss named Helgao appears every 2 weeks. A soldier warns that there are only 4 minutes left for the raid to begin. The guild had spent a lot of time and money strengthening themselves, definitely much stronger than last time. But then, an intruder appeared on the scene. All the members turned to see the user at the cave entrance. Who is the stranger, they thought. He has a weak presence and an unimposing appearance. How did he manage to bypass the defenses of the lower floors? He was just wearing a dirty cloak. Maybe he was a highly trained assassin. But an assassin would never reveal their presence in this way. A window shows that the player's name is Grid. Although in this summary we will also call him Grid. Pixword quickly searches among the ranked users for this name, but there is no such ranking. No player knew the user, so Pixword expels him from the place. This is an area controlled by the Silver Knights Guild. I don't know how you got here, but we are about to have an important battle. If you don't want to die, leave, Pixword said. Then, the hooded figure murmurs a few words. I was worried because my stealth disappeared. Maybe it's because of Helgao's presence. Then, I wouldn't need your cloak anymore, and proceeds to take it off, revealing an imposing armor. The group was completely stunned. The armor the player was wearing was impressive, perhaps of a unique grade, and even had a tail that seemed to have a life of its own. The members couldn't look away. Pixword grits his teeth and orders the player's expulsion, but then an explosion is heard behind him. He's here. The monster boss Helgao had appeared, towering over everyone with an intimidating presence. Windows show the monster's appearance. Helgao lets out a scream that instills fear, chaos, and weakening effects. Helgao's fire also reduced heat resistance by 50%. Then, the monster uses the Fire Pillar's ability, causing a massive explosion and wiping out a large part of the group. With a single ability, he had taken out half of the users. Pixword had increased his fire resistance by 86%, but still received a lot of damage. Then, footsteps are heard, and the stranger advances through the fire as if nothing. How was that possible? He resisted Helgao's powerful flames and suffered no damage. Then, the young man begins to summon something. It was a pickaxe with which he began to dig as if nothing. Good heavens! What were they seeing? Pixword's eyes were wide open. The young man was collecting materials right in front of Helgao. He complained, "It's so hot. Why do these minerals only appear when the boss reappears?" Lost in his thoughts, the monster boss raises his scythe and points it at the young man's back, causing a huge explosion. It was a direct hit. No one would be able to withstand it. However, he was completely unscathed and, addressing Pixword, issues a warning. "Hey sir, aren't you going to do anything about him? It's hot now, but it's going to get hotter." The rank 16 thought that wasn't the issue and asked directly, "Didn't his attack hurt you?" Meanwhile, Helgao was initiating another attack, and just before his scythe hit the player, he blocked it with his tail. Pixword couldn't close his mouth as he watched the incredible scene. Grid explains that it was thanks to the item's effect, and as you must have already realized, the protagonist of this story is not Pixword, but the young man with the impressive armor, Shin Young-woo. Although we will call him by his nickname, Grid, from this scene where we introduce the protagonist and what he will become. We will take a trip to the past to learn about his story and see how and when he became so powerful. Someone is fleeing. It's our protagonist, Grid, who is being pursued by guards. Why are they chasing me, he wonders. Then, he is reached by the sword of one of his pursuers. Am I going to die here, he wonders. Fool, you abused our generosity. Your greed blinded you, even when we had an agreement, Asur says. He reveals to Grid that he never expected him to complete the mission he was given. Grid responds that he fought for months to complete it and therefore deserved a reward. Asur agreed to reward him, but with death. Grid turned around and cursed Count Asur. Here, manhwa explains to us that Satisfy is the best virtual reality game in the world. There are about 2 billion active players around the world. There is a multitude of content and landscapes in this game, making it seem like another world. In Satisfy, there are countless unexplored places, and this was one of them, the cave of the extreme north, the deepest zone. A location with all kinds of equipment and items stacked, patiently waiting for someone to come and discover them. Placing us at this location an hour before the chase scene. Grid, a level 73 warrior, celebrates finding an item to complete a Count Osir's S-level mission. The protagonist was supposed to deliver the rare book of the legendary craftsman. With tears in his eyes, Grid remembered all the obstacles he had to overcome to get to this point, all for this stupid S-level mission that he couldn't even abandon. If he wasn't well rewarded, he definitely wouldn't work with Osir again. When Grid prepared to review the item, its status appeared as unknown. To review it, he needed to use Palion's Eye. Palion's Eye, exclaimed the protagonist. This item cost about $500 in real life. How much more money do I have to spend to complete this mission? Lamented the protagonist. However, there would always be the next month to save, so he decided to buy the item. When using the eye to evaluate the item, Grid discovered that it was a legendary grade item, Pagma's book. This contained the secrets of the legendary blacksmith Pagma, and the user who used it would become Pagma's descendant. By discovering the item, the player's reputation rose by 500 points across the continent. Grid was speechless. The protagonist couldn't contain the excitement of the legendary class. With it, he could obtain the most powerful class in the game. However, he had to deliver the book to complete the mission. Who cared about the mission at this point? If he sold it on the online market, he could get billions of wands. The protagonist had many debts from the money he borrowed to play the game. He invested so much time that his friends gradually drifted away from him, and even his own family considered him a waste. But everything had ended now that he had obtained the book. Ready to sell it, Grid ordered to end the session. But then a window appeared indicating that he couldn't disconnect at this time. Next, he was notified that Osir's secret S-level mission had changed to an SS-level mission, the departure of Isla Sur. The Count appeared with his army. Bastard, greed has blinded you, the Count complained to Grid for trying to steal the mission item. Now, the Count would try to assassinate him. However, Grid shouted angrily that the mission given to him was too complicated for the reward offered. Osir ordered his men to finish him. But before the guard could execute him, Grid escaped. I won't die like this, thought Grid. He was a level 73 warrior. At least he would try to do something. The protagonist summoned a shield, but it was easily destroyed by the guardian. Furthermore, the impact threw him several meters back. Even though he blocked the attack, he lost half of his health. Grid knew that Osir was around level 300, but even his guardians were very powerful. Grid accepted his death. But looking at his inventory, he remembered that he still had Pagma's book. Under normal conditions, it would remain in his inventory even after death, but because it was part of a mission, he would obtain it if he killed Osir. He only had one way out. He tried to open the book, but it was too late. Grid used the item and began his class change. All the protagonist's stats and abilities were reset. Grid became the descendant of Pagma and obtained numerous passive and active skills. The protagonist loved his warrior class for fighting, but now he had become a user of the blacksmith class. This bothered him, but he thought it was worth it when he saw Osir's desperate expression. Then, the class change was completed, and Grid obtained the title of someone who would become a legend. Unaware that he was now at a negative level, Grid was willing to kill all his enemies, but his hopes were interrupted by a sword strike. You have died. After using the book and changing his class to a legendary one, our protagonist was defeated by Osir's knights. As a result, the protagonist's level, which had been reset to level 1, was reduced by 2 more levels. So currently, he is at negative level -1. Is this possible? In addition to dying, he failed to deliver the legendary book to Count Osir, so from now on, he was banned from accessing the Patron region. Before disappearing, Grid dedicated a few words to the Count. You really ended an innocent, dirty thief, stealing what I deserve legitimately. Besides, it's just a game, murmured Grid. But before disappearing, he wished that Osir would live in the worst possible way. After this scene, we were teleported to a real-world building, specifically to the room of our protagonist, who emerged completely exhausted from his capsule to play Satisfy. That was so much fun, exclaimed Grid. However, as our protagonist lamented missing the opportunity to get rich, a more fearsome monster than any other creature in Satisfy appeared. An angry mother. Do you know what time it is, son? Asked Grid's angry mother. If you have been through this situation, sign up to join our family. Meanwhile, in another part of the country, At the operations offices of the Satisfy SA Group, a supercar arrived at the entrance. The head of the Satisfy operations team came down to greet the game's lead developer, who incredulously asked if someone had really managed to change classes. "It was just 5 minutes ago," she said. "It sounds fun," exclaimed the president. At headquarters, the head of the operations team detailed the player's report. His real name is Shin Yonghwa and his character's name is Grid. He was level 73, but currently is at a negative level. He obtained Pagma's book through Count Osir's secret mission and, according to the information department, he is an unemployed, uneducated game addict. Over the past 3 months, he has explored numerous times, dying several times in the process. Although we were instructed to carefully examine the legendary class he just obtained, it seems that he obtained it legitimately through his obsession and determination in the game. The developer praised such persistence from the protagonist. However, the head of the team found it very frustrating that this happened by mere chance. But the lead developer responded that he found it fun because, according to his calculations, the book should have been found 2 years ago, and Grid not only obtained the associated mission but also found the extreme north cave. This mission location could not be a coincidence, but rather Grid's effort to not give up like other players. Besides this minute possibility, the lead developer also realized that the protagonist's negative level, which initially seems like a disadvantage, is actually an advantage, as when he rises to level 1, from where all players start, he will have superior statistics to the rest of the players, as he will have risen 2 levels to reach level 1. The head of the team reacted quickly. "We must quickly correct this to avoid unbalancing the game." However, the president expressed that we should not give it too much importance, as the descendant of Pagma is relatively weak in combat compared to other warrior classes. However, after saying this, the president realized something. Returning to the protagonist, he was receiving payment for his real-life work while the rest of the workers judged him. The protagonist chose to ignore them and leave with the money. He looked and smelled bad, and his work was very poor, the protagonist heard. He lamented in a park. He really had no talent, and his situation was terrible, both in real life and in the game. He would have to start from scratch, but he decided to try again. Grid went back home and entered the capsule to log into Satisfy. "Even though I've lost everything, I'm curious about the legendary class I obtained," the protagonist murmured. No matter what he had to do, he was determined to make money. Grid was transported to the world of Satisfy, appearing half-naked in a strange forest. "What the hell? Where am I?" Grid wondered, surveying the area. It seemed to be in the Patreon region, but in an unexplored area. The protagonist searched for some sign to help him locate himself when he heard something. Grid noticed a scream coming from a strange tower in the middle of the forest. Inside, there was a girl lying on a cross, while strange figures dressed in robes uttered words in a language he had never heard before. They seemed to be performing some kind of ritual. What the hell is this place? Apparently, Grid had entered the Temple of Yaten. Upon realizing this, a shiver ran down Grid's body. My goodness! Temples are usually places for players above level 150. I should get out of here, Grid thought. He opened his status window, which, in addition to showing his new class and title, indicated his current poor condition. However, upon reviewing the new abilities he had obtained, he came across a very interesting one. All items can be used, but other penalties will be applied outside the item restrictions. Grid had to test this, so he equipped his old armor and sword. It seemed that the ability worked, as Grid could use level 60 items, despite being at a negative level. The power to use higher-level equipment was accompanied by a significant increase in the protagonist's basic statistics, although restrictions for using higher-level equipment soon appeared to dampen his spirits. It didn't take long for the sword's attacks to be reduced by 30%, while the armor's defense decreased by 20%. Nevertheless, he still remained infinitely superior to the items he could use for his current level. It was at this moment that Grid realized how fantastic this new class he had unlocked was. However, a thought invaded his mind. If this dungeon is level 150, it means that everything around this area is at a similar level. A scream interrupted his thoughts. If this is the Temple of Yaten, these strangers must be followers of Yaten and seem to be in the middle of some ceremony. The level of these mages is much higher than what Grid currently possesses, so he is no match for them. However, it shouldn't be a problem if he leaves without being discovered. It was at this moment that someone touched Grid from behind. His first reaction was to strike with the sword. "Easy, kid. Are you trying to kill me?" whispered the unknown person. The stranger removed the hood and introduced himself as Doran, a secret guard under the orders of Count Stein. Apparently, he had come to rescue the girl lying on the altar, who was Count Stein's daughter named Irene and had been kidnapped by Yatin's followers during her vacation. "It's a complicated situation, but it's good to have someone on my side," said the guard Doran. Grid was about to reject the proposal immediately, but a new mission appeared: rescue the esteemed daughter of the Count. Reward: 3,000 gold and the opportunity to become the Count's son-in-law. If you fail, you will lose 2 levels. Damn it, another S-class mission, Grid thought. Doran thought that our protagonist must be a very powerful person because, in this situation where they were outnumbered by so many men, he remained steadfast, without a hint of fear. Grid found it strange and reviewed his passive abilities. Composure. The probability of falling under an abnormal condition is drastically reduced. Recovery speed is increased. Wow, Grid would have to take a look at the rest of the abilities later. It must be my lucky day. It really comforts me to have the support of a warrior like you, poor Doran thanked, unaware of Grid's situation. But if I don't go help no, the protagonist refuted. Faced with this response, Doran tried to insist once more, but the protagonist's answer remained negative. Doran was surprised by Grid's coldness and tried a little harder. The protagonist did not want to lose the 3,000 gold that the mission offered, equivalent to over 3.6 million Korean won, but, being logical, it was foolish to accept another S-class mission. Amid the heated discussion, Grid accidentally pushed a rock that fell on a follower of Yatin, killing him and triggering the mission to rescue Count Stein's daughter. Then, Doran joined him. Now they would have to face these dark mages if he didn't want to die. Doran offered to clear a path for the protagonist to rescue the young Irene, but there were many dark wizards. To make matters worse, due to the restrictions, Grid's current statistics were comparable to those of a level 34, so he had no chance against so many Yatin's followers. While lamenting his pitiful feeling, he was saved by Doran, who seemed to be very powerful, quickly dispatching a group of wizards with his daggers. This surprised Grid, and an idea crossed his mind. With him by my side, maybe I can survive. However, he immediately regretted that thought when overwhelmed by the number of enemies. Outnumbered, Doran reasoned that the best idea was to descend directly to the altar, so he pushed Grid. "I'm dead!" Grid shouted at the top of his lungs. But before hitting the ground, the guard used the levitate skill, surprising Grid. Although grateful to Doran for saving him, they were now right in front of the enemy. Yatin's followers began casting their spells, and facing a possible enemy counterattack, Doran dispatched the mages before they could finish their incantation. In response, some followers threw themselves against the intruders to buy time for the wizards. Meanwhile, the protagonist was no match in this battle, so all that was left was to cheer on the NPC. However, this had the opposite effect, distracting Doran, who was hit by an enemy spell. The only option left for Grid was to switch sides. "Actually, I've always wanted to become a servant of Yatin," murmured the protagonist. The black mages had prematurely sung victory, as the guard resisted the dark magic, surprising both Grid and the enemies. This time, however, it was Doran who attacked, but his attack was repelled by a shield. "Today is my lucky day," Grid was surprised to hear a female voice. Another player had appeared. "My S-class mission is to protect the ritual at all costs." I was afraid of how far they could go, but my opponent is an NPC named Doran, the girl said, excited. "I haven't felt this emotional in a long time." "I'm Yura. May I fight you?" she asked. It was Yura, known as the Blood Witch, the #1 player in Black Magic, and 5th in the unified rankings. She was a very famous Korean player, both in the game and in real life, often appearing on television. Why the hell is she here? Grid wondered. Yura launched an attack that our protagonists narrowly dodged and asked our protagonist, "Are you the one who accepted this S-class mission? Thanks to you, I can test my new ability without the cameras seeing me. Although it will be a tough fight for you." Yura thought that Grid would be around level 80 after seeing his equipment. On the other hand, our protagonist was already facing difficulties with the level of the NPCs in the area, but now that a ranker had joined them, he was really in trouble. However, he had the powerful Doran by his side. Even though she was a ranker, it wouldn't be an easy mission. Yura began to prepare another attack, wanting to test how powerful she was now that she had reached level 230. Our protagonists, in turn, were on high alert. Doran moved quickly and attacked the mage, but fell into her trap and was immobilized. He then used his blades to free himself from the traps and then attacked the rancor. Yura easily dodged the attack and attacked Doran again, having him exactly where she wanted. This time, she activated a spell that drained the guard's blood, leaving him in critical condition. The protagonist couldn't do anything in this situation. Yura had to use 30% of her mana to use this ability and finish off the NPC, but it wasn't the end. Doran managed to survive. He was using a very powerful item. This left the rancor speechless, as he had used the level 220 Mesmerize ability, obtaining unlimited defense against enemy attacks for a certain period of time. The protagonist asked in surprise, "Are you okay?" "Yes, thanks to this ring and its ability," mumbled Doran, tired. "It should protect me from your curses and speed up my recovery." It was an incredible item, so he asked her to give it to him, but it wasn't time for jokes, as they were facing a formidable opponent. The guard attacked Yura again, who thought about preparing an attack to eliminate both of them once and for all. However, she didn't know how powerful the other warrior accompanying the NPC could be. Despite using low-level equipment, he was in a high-level area. Grid couldn't afford to be distracted for a moment, as the Yatten they had previously defeated were reappearing. Yura took advantage of the distraction to launch her most powerful attack, depleting all her mana reserves to finish off both at once. "It's over," lamented Doran. With an attack of this caliber, they couldn't survive. However, the protagonist stepped forward to protect the NPC. The attack caused a huge explosion in the tower, but Yura was certain that they couldn't resist such an attack. Far from reality, they were alive and well after receiving my spell. Who the hell is this guy? There was no way Yura wouldn't know such a powerful player. It was then that she realized that it was thanks to another feature of her new class, specifically the ability "A Legend Does Not Die Easily," whereby when health drops, the protagonist becomes invulnerable to all attacks for 5 seconds. A very broken ability. Yura, in turn, remained completely bewildered, as she believed she was at level 80, but survived her most powerful attack without a scratch. It seemed that she was starting to feel something for Grid, as from her point of view, it seemed like the protagonist was smiling warmly at her. This opportunity was seized by Doran, who, using Grid as a springboard, rose to counterattack the Dark Mage. However, Yura still had an ace up her sleeve and would protect herself with a defensive spell. The rancor, however, had to react quickly and finish off the unknown player before it was too late, but when she looked at his location, there was no sign of him. He simply disappeared. What the hell is this user Grid thinking? It left both allies and enemies bewildered. From the protagonist's point of view, in reality, he died again, losing 2 more levels in the process. And as punishment for dying twice in less than 24 hours, he would be denied access to Satisfy for the next 12 hours. Let's replay the scene to find out what really happened. When Doran propelled himself onto Grid's back, he caused damage to him, reducing the protagonist's health points to 0, ending the player's life. "It was all this NPC's fault," grumbled the protagonist, returning to see the outcome of the fight. The rancor thought that Grid was giving her the mission as a gesture of sympathy, which she didn't like. "I swear I will find you and never forgive you," Yura thought. The protagonist was very angry, blaming Rancor for interfering in his mission, so he entered the game forum to seek revenge. That's when Grid wrote several negative comments to discredit the player. It seemed like a new defender of the neighborhood had been born. The protagonist's ecstasy was interrupted by someone. It was his sister Shin Siege, asking what her older brother was doing to be so agitated. Grid's room was a mess, which worried his younger sister. As she approached to see what her brother was doing, she read Grid's comments. He apologized, saying it was unintentional, but ended up disappointing his sister. "Is everything Yura's fault? Is she also trying to ruin my life outside the game?" thought the protagonist, accusing Yura again. The next day, Grid was home alone. His parents and sister had gone out. He had a simple plan: to have breakfast while watching his favorite news channel, Satisfy. A new idea popped into Grid's mind. If this guy can become famous, can I also get rich? That's when the announcer talked about the Yatten Tower, which was completely destroyed the night before. Grid seemed to have an idea of who could have done it. The announcer had been investigating and all the evidence pointed to one person, the rancor number 5, Yura. Judging by the ruins, she must have had a very intense battle. There seemed to be a testimony from a player who witnessed the scene. "I was running away from a monster when I heard a noise coming from the tower. Yura was fighting a guy and cast her best spell. Yura is even more beautiful in person," the fan said for everyone to hear. But the result was so surprising that even Yura was left speechless, as the guy didn't have a scratch after the spell's impact. Yura was fighting a top ranker? Exclaimed the announcer. But the fan of Yura was crushed by a rock, so he couldn't see his face. Have I become famous? Thought Grid, confused in his house. This can only mean that I'll get rich. Grid quickly grabbed his phone, called the news channel's inquiry center, and exclaimed that he was the user who fought Yura. They asked for his name and level, but when Grid mentioned being level less than 3, they immediately hung up. How would they believe me? The last thing they knew about the temple was this image. It seems that in the end, Doran had to sacrifice himself to save Irene. Even though he was an NPC, he was a good person and had a very interesting ring. After closing the chapter of the Yatten Tower, they started interviewing a rising player, Katz, level 203. I guess everyone already knows who I am, exclaimed the arrogant player. Grid had heard of him. He was a famous arrogant boy, the son of the head of a large corporation. The interviewer asked Katz how he reached the top 53 so quickly. The user mentioned that he had gained 30 levels in 3 months, which surprised Grid, as it took him several years to reach level 70. Before answering the interviewer, Katz wanted to take the opportunity to challenge the Korean ranker Yura. This is the end of your era. I will be the next top ranker, said the lunatic. Grid thought that, even though he was top 53, he didn't stand a chance against the top 5. Although Grid also didn't like Yura, she was a monster on another level. After Katz's declaration of war, he exclaimed that his rapid advancement was due to this sword. He then activated a skill and modified the sword. It seemed that he had a passive ability that modified the sword he used to give it vitality in exchange for more attack damage. The more vitality he absorbed, the more attack he would have. He obtained this ability thanks to his epic class called Warrior's Blood, 1 level below the legendary class that Grid possessed, but it was also a hidden class that few could obtain. This excited the protagonist, who was eager to learn more about his own class. Determined, Grid returned to the game and appeared in the Bairan village. Clearly, he couldn't reappear in a destroyed Yatten temple. In this village, there seemed to be many players recruiting members, although the level requirements were very high. Amidst the shouts, he heard a player looking for members above level 200 to search for blue or chalum, the strongest mineral. All the members sought had to be above level 100, so Grid reappeared in a high-level area. That's when he saw a carriage. It was his opportunity to go to a beginner's village. But when he asked about the cost of the trip, they asked for 10 gold coins. Grid had nothing, so he would have to find another solution. Now, Grid had a new class, the descendant of Pagma. He began to review his skills to experiment. It seemed that he could increase his statistics and reputation by creating items. Furthermore, it seemed that he had mastered the skills of a blacksmith. He had legendary blacksmithing at level 1, while he had already mastered the rest of them. It was something amazing. The main blacksmith had barely reached the intermediate level of blacksmithing skill. One of the abilities that Grid possessed was creation. He had his own production method with the help of the system. Thanks to the legendary blacksmith skill, he could create 3 items of that class for each level he gained. Currently, he could design 3 items. The television object was epic, but a legendary level 1 would be much better. Therefore, Grid activated the legendary blacksmith skill. He planned to make a sword for hunting and leveling up. The system asked about the materials he would use to create the weapon, and he remembered that they mentioned that blue orichalcum was the best material. So, he would design his sword using that mineral as a base. Now he would have to design the sword. A window appeared for him to paint how he would like his sword to be. He was very excited and started adding unrealistic statistics, such as 10 million in attack statistics and the ability to summon meteorites. He wanted it to look like a shark, and in the end, it looked like a mix between an anchovy and a shark, but our protagonist liked it because he created it himself. A new window appeared. The system automatically calibrated the statistics according to the design and materials used. The weapon statistics would be adjusted and corrected to be realistic. Grid had created plans for a fantastic weapon, with over 1,000 durability points and almost 2,000 attack points, as well as increasing agility by 50 points. Even though the statistics he input were adjusted, it was a sword like no other. However, the conditions for using the weapon were ridiculous. It was necessary to be at level 300 or higher, have over 5,000 strength, and have advanced sword mastery at level 8 or higher. This was madness. as the top unified ranker had barely reached level 250 recently. It was an item that no one in the game could use, however. He could use it thanks to his skill, and even with its limitations, it would still be very powerful. With the plans ready, now he just needed to obtain the mineral to create the sword. When he asked to join the group, he was directly rejected, as it was for level 190s and the protagonist seemed to be at level 60. Grid lied, saying he was level 100, and although he used lower-level equipment, his control was very good, so it didn't affect him much. From his appearance, they knew that the protagonist was probably lying, but before they could expel him from the place, another player arrived and said that his group would take care of the fight. Thus, Grid could take care of other things. It seemed to be the reign of the first place, the ranking of martial artists better known as Sacred Fists. The boy's level was 180, but in his class it was very difficult to level up, so it was an achievement. The protagonist thought he was lucky to be strong and handsome, but he was supporting him. So he would swallow his words. "I could even take care of the cleaning," exclaimed excited Grid. The companion did not seem convinced, so they decided to test the protagonist's skills in a one-on-one fight against Regis. Grid was scared, so he quickly fled the scene, as he did not want to die again. Remember that in the previous chapter, Grid could not join the raid to obtain the mineral for his sword. Regis thought it would have been good to have him on the team and wondered why he left. Now the protagonist would have to resort to his initial plan of the carriage. But first, he would have to get some money. At that moment, he received a notification to name the object he had created a short time ago. He could not obtain the material, so he named it as a failure. Now that he knew he could create limited items, he would only design them when necessary and when he had the resources. This is the first video on the channel, the first of many, and for an excellent debut, bringing you a wonderful work, Overgeared. Leave a like so I know you liked it and bring the continuation of the anime here. If you don't want to miss the next releases, subscribe and leave a like. This is very important to us. In addition to the comments, which generate engagement for the channel, I await you in the next nerd recap. Trying to get some money, he went to a blacksmith's forge and tried to sell the plans for the object he had created. However, the blacksmith rejected him, thinking that he was belittling the work of the forge. Faced with the blacksmith's harsh words, the protagonist collapsed as he left the forge. Upon hearing his cries, the blacksmith came out and offered him work cutting wood to pay something to Grid. A new mission appeared for him, to cut 500 pieces of wood to obtain 10 experience and 20 bronze. Excited, he thanked the man and started working. It was a very simple mission, and it had been a long time since he had done one of that level. However, the game was very realistic, so failing to cut the wood was very likely. Maybe it will help to value the item with my new skills, thought Grid. Ancient Axe, Normal Classification, Durability 6, and Attack Power between 4 and 7. Understanding of the Ancient Axe is 100%. You have learned to use the old axe. Is it thanks to the passive skill? Thought the protagonist. He then realized that there was a spot on the wood indicating where to strike. Upon doing so, the piece split exactly in half, showcasing an incredible skill that Grid had achieved with just one strike. If one reaches the maximum understanding of a legendary object, they will become successful very quickly. But now he had to quickly finish the woodcutting mission. However, after 2 hours, Grid was completely exhausted, as the stamina of a level -3 was terrible, and he had only managed to cut 150 pieces of wood. Even though he was exhausted, he couldn't give up at this moment, as it was his last chance to leave the city. Grid picked up the axe again and struck once more, unlocking a new statistic, persistence. He couldn't easily tire, the equipment weight limit increased, the feeling of satiety increased, and it was a statistic that could be improved thanks to his effort. Grid had unlocked a legendary statistic and felt rejuvenated. Now he could finish the job. After 4 hours, Grid managed to finish cutting all the wood, and instead of 500 pieces, he had cut 1,000, all in 6 hours, surprising the blacksmith. Despite my appearance, I am also a blacksmith, Grid revealed to the Lord, which he thought would be a lie. Then, he offered him another mission. He would have to mine 80 iron minerals to believe in him, and as a reward, he would get 55 experience points and 50 affinity points with a blacksmith. It was his opportunity, as if Grid completed the mission, he would be able to level up to level 0. When he arrived at the mine, he was completely exhausted, as he had to walk for almost 4 more hours to get there. The miners thought that, due to his frail body, he would hinder more than help, so they sent the protagonist to a corner to try to imitate the professionals. But when they heard how he struck with the pickaxe, All the miners turned around. As with each blow the protagonist made, new iron ores appeared. The miners were amazed, as an incredible miner had been born. After a while, Grid managed to mine a total of 170 iron minerals. Grid celebrated with great enthusiasm for having achieved it, and all this was thanks to his persistence. After completing the mission, a notification appeared that Grid had leveled up to level 1. Now that he had finally leveled up to level 1, his punishment stats were restored to a normal state, in addition to adding the stats of a descendant of Pagma. But when Grid reviewed his stats, he was greatly shocked, as the normal stats of a level 1 totaled 22 points, but as a descendant of Pagma, he had a total of 165 points, combining all his stats. Additionally, he had 40 extra stat points that he could add to other attributes. This was because, upon leveling up, one obtains 10 stat points that can be allocated to improve their avatar, but as he started from level -3, he had to level up 4 times to reach level 1. Astounding! Exclaimed our tired protagonist upon returning to the blacksmith smith. His perception of Grid completely changed after completing the missions assigned to him, increasing the affinity with the blacksmith by 60 points and the reputation in the village of Byran by 200. Upon returning to the village, the behavior of Lord Smith changed completely. The protagonist asked him to teach how to create an item that sells well. The blacksmith agreed and showed a Yafa arrow. At first glance, it looks like a normal arrow, but it has the Yafa mineral mixed with the arrow steel, giving it the effect of ignoring part of the opponent's defense, essential for missions against golems that drop the blue orichalca mineral. The protagonist proceeded to use his appraisal skill on the arrow, gaining an 89% understanding of the arrow, being able to use it skillfully. Apparently, he will have to disassemble it and understand the production method to fully comprehend it. Fortunately, the blacksmith smith will help understand the process after the blacksmith's explanation of metal casting to create the arrows. The protagonist starts working. Thanks to being a descendant of Pagma, he receives instructions on how to perform each process carefully. He is sensitive to temperature, being able to measure it accurately, and the temperature appears in a window. After finishing the casting process, he gains 80 experience points and increases his affinity with the blacksmith by 30 points, earning 3 Yaffle ingots as a reward. Blacksmith Smith is surprised by Grid's ability to perform the process perfectly on his first attempt. "It's as if Pagma is resurfacing," said the excited blacksmith. Grid, on the other hand, thought it was not his reincarnation, but rather his successor. With the mission completed, he also levels up, now being level 2. Smith continues to explain the process of creating the arrows. The next step is to create the tips, and in this part, he must be very careful, cleaning the impurities that may have formed to then join them with the shaft and feathers, creating a perfect balance. After learning the production method of the Yafa arrow with the blacksmith, thus increasing his understanding to 100%, it is Grid's turn. However, Smith forgot to teach him how to create the arrow shafts, but this will not be necessary, as the protagonist increased his understanding to 100%, adding a new item to his production list, which he hopes to fully complete someday. While the metal cools in the molds, the protagonist creates the arrow shafts and feathers. Smith is surprised that he managed to do this after only seeing the process once. Returning to the arrowheads, Grid would add a step to the production, making the Yafa arrows even more resilient, surprising the blacksmith, as it is not an easy process. In an instant, Grid managed to create better arrows than any other to sell them at a higher price. Given that a normal Yafa arrow usually costs 6 silver units, but the protagonist would have to stand out in order to sell at a higher price. With the improvement in arrowheads, it was time to assemble them with a shaft to finalize the arrow. In doing so, a skill of Pagma's descendant, the legendary blacksmith's breath, is activated, increasing the weapon statistics created by 5% when Grid is focused, and there is a chance that the created object will obtain special characteristics. Grid didn't know what was happening, but upon finishing, he had created a special Yafa arrow, which had the possibility of completely ignoring the opponent's statistics, in addition to having incredibly improved attack damage. In his first attempt, Grid managed to create an epic level item, obtaining the reward for creating an epic item, increasing all his statistics by 4 points and raising his reputation by 80 throughout the continent. With the experience gained, he also rises to level 3. However, the protagonist is disappointed because he wanted his first epic level item to be a sword. Pagma's descendant's class was amazing, as he had just created the best arrow in Satisfy. After the help, Grid leaves Lord Smith's forge, thanking him for all the lessons and help. To bid farewell, the blacksmith presents him with 100 special Yafa arrows he had created, and some material ingots. Grid is grateful, but needs to head to the city to sell the arrows and make some money, so he bids farewell to Smith. Elsewhere in Satisfy, the group that went in search of the blue orichalcum mineral was battling the forest golems to obtain them. Here we are introduced to the group leader named Jishuka. Despite the main members being very powerful, the rest of the players were being annihilated by the golems. Even with the casualties, they managed to defeat the leader, obtaining as rewards 30 black iron minerals, 7 orichalcum, and 1 blue orichalcum. It seems that the group wanted to obtain the boss's amethyst shield, although this item had the worst drop rate and this time it had not appeared either. 75 members of the group had been defeated during the mission. It was the 4th raid they had made, and with so many casualties, fewer and fewer players were showing up. The Sadaka group was formed only by high-level rankers, but the size was reduced, so they were not as well known. They needed the amethyst shield for another linked mission, but they had no luck with the drop of this item. In response, the leader ordered the group to focus on leveling up individually. They would have to level up 15 levels in the next 3 months if they didn't want to die. After the meeting, the leader went to buy more Yafa arrows, but when the seller showed her the arrows for sale, there were some more expensive than the rest. They were 3 times more expensive than the common Yafa arrows. When she saw the color of the arrows, she was surprised. They were purple arrows, which meant they were of epic level, capable of completely ignoring the enemy's armor. She had already spoken to numerous blacksmiths to make something similar, but no one had the level to do it. If they hadn't created them, there was a blacksmith who surpassed the best blacksmiths in Satisfy. She had to make an offer immediately for these arrows. Therefore, the leader Jishuka sent out an announcement to the guild. They had to find this blacksmith before other guilds did, as he was the best blacksmith on the entire continent, and all the guilds would cause chaos to recruit him. The news spread quickly and soon reached the ears of Panmir, the number 1 ranked blacksmith. The game had described Grid as a master craftsman, something not even the top-ranked person was called in the descriptions of Satisfy's history. Only 2 people had managed to create an epic item, and he was the first person to do so, putting all his effort into the forge. But who was this new blacksmith? Panmir wondered. The next day, the protagonist woke up early to go to the employment office. There were many people, and they were always ahead of the protagonist in tasks. He tried his luck the next day, but was exhausted. Before leaving, he was stopped by his father, who asked him to sit down so they could eat as a family. If he did that, his father would pay him what he earned in a day's work. The protagonist was very grateful for the family he had and asked his father to pay his debts, receiving a pot of rice on his head as a response. After that, Grid returned to Satisfy, having hardly rested at all, but he needed to play. When he opened the market to see at what price his arrows were sold, he was completely surprised. The winning bid bought his arrows for 72 silver coins per unit, which was 12 times more expensive than a normal arrow. Multiplying this by the 99 arrows he sold, it totaled 71 gold coins and 28 silver coins. A madness. This would be equivalent to 120,000 Korean won, so he wouldn't need to go to the office for work in real life anymore. He rushed to claim his 71 gold coins, but there was a commission for selling epic items in the market, so he received 60 gold coins and 59 silver coins. A new idea came to Grid's mind. If he could make money selling items, he wouldn't need to leave the city. This thought disappeared as quickly as he remembered that the owner of the forge in that city was Mr. Smith. So, he rented a carriage and headed to a city called Winston, where apparently the Stein family's blacksmith would become the new lord of the city. The name sounded familiar to Grid, but they were already very close to the city. Finally, he had arrived at the new city, which was 4 times larger than the previous one and seemed more lively. The first thing our protagonist decided to do was to find a place to store his inventory. Before that, he evaluated his sword and armor, as increasing his understanding of them would also reduce the level limitations. When evaluating, Grid obtained a 33% understanding with the sword and 6% with the armor. Understanding the armor came with a reduction of its penalties that limited the items by level. The reduction of the sword's power went from 30% to 20%, while the reduction of the armor's 20% defense he had now only went to 8%. Now that he understood the understanding system, he could try to repair the durability of these items to increase the understanding to the maximum, but he would leave that for another occasion for economic reasons. Storing items in the warehouse also costs 30 silver coins. Everything costs money. After leaving his armor and sword in the warehouse, he decided to take the only special arrow from Yafa that he hadn't sold, to keep as a memento. Now that Grid was using lighter equipment, he felt like he could fly. It was much more comfortable than his heavy armor. In the city, There seemed to be players of all levels, from beginners to experts, but the protagonist didn't have time for that, so he went to the forge. It was a huge building, so there should be at least an intermediate-level blacksmith in that place, which meant they would treat Grid well. As a descendant of Pagma, the intermediate or higher-level NPC blacksmiths would favorably treat him. Upon entering the building, he saw that it was all empty, but there seemed to be a person. There was a strange old man lying down, who asked who he was. Grid replied that he had come to create the best-selling item, but the old man explained that recently the Marrow Company was selling items at very low prices and in large quantities, so the items from his forge had not been sold for a long time, and therefore he closed the shop. This news disappointed the protagonist, as it was the only forge in the city. Then, another group of people entered, shouting at the old man. The protagonist thought he didn't want to get into more trouble. Then, the group that entered showed a purchase contract for the building, asking the old man to sign and hand over the building. The grumpy old man said there was a limit to being kind, and apparently the large Marrow Company planned to force the old man to sell the forge. Before getting into more trouble, the protagonist decided to escape, but was stopped by the redhead, who asked if he was a spy from the company. The protagonist didn't count on his equipment, so he couldn't confront them. Therefore, he says that he is new in town and didn't know that the bandit's blacksmith had closed. The bandit understands the situation and kicks him out of the place. The elder had no intentions of selling the business, so the bandits will try to force the sale. One of them insults the elder's deceased son, which our protagonist cannot tolerate. However, he is not a hero at that moment. Grid receives a new mission from the warrior. He will have to get rid of the Marrow Company's henchmen and break the blacksmith's contract. As a reward, the Elder Khan's alcoholism will improve, and he will have maximum affinity with Grid. Additionally, just by accepting the mission, he will gain the ability Ferrero's Wrath. However, if he fails, the Elder will die in a few days, and he will not have access to missions related to him. Even though the odds are low, Grid is determined to accept it. Among Grid's abilities is the legendary Blacksmith's Patience, which improves the protagonist's health, defense, and stamina by 200% for 1 hour. He also has the passive ability of immunity for 5 seconds and, although he is level 3, he has level 20 statistics. It's a shame he doesn't have his combat equipment, but he still has his epic grade arrow, with a characteristic of bypassing his opponent's armor. You don't know when to stop insulting an elder, Grid said aloud. The elder was surprised because Grid hadn't left. Grid pointed his arrow at the group leader and expressed his discontent. Even though they are debt collectors, there is a limit to these things, bastards. These words irritated the collectors, but by accepting the mission, Grid acquired the blacksmith's wrath, increasing his attack by 10% and his attack speed by 30%. For 20 seconds, the leader struck at Grid, but he managed to dodge. The enemies were really fast, even though they were only at level 30. Grid took advantage of a narrow staircase to avoid being surrounded, and when they came after him, he activated his new ability, delivering a critical blow to an enemy. The rest were surprised, as their friend had been defeated by an arrow. The protagonist was inflamed and continued to provoke the debt collectors. However, he had a limited time to defeat the level 35 enemy, being at level 3. Grid gained 4,300 experience, leveling up 5 levels at once. Now, he had a total of 110 stat points to distribute among his attributes. As there were still 4 enemies, he used all his points, putting 50 into strength and the remaining 60 into agility. There were still 10 seconds with the blacksmith's wrath, so he tried to defeat another henchman before the ability went on cooldown. However, this time he didn't land a critical hit, and the enemy survived. The collectors realized they couldn't confront him on the stairs, but the protagonist also couldn't wait forever. With a plan in mind, he decided to descend and confront them head-on. If surrounded, he would only need to finish them all at once and activate the blacksmith's patience to sustain his health enough. However, when he tried to activate the ability, he couldn't, as it activated automatically. Grid was in trouble, but he couldn't die, so he dodged the enemy's attacks and took an intermediate-level potion. He had to keep dodging, but there were too many. One of the bandits managed to cut his leg. Grid was in a terrible situation. He didn't want to spend potions on a rank B mission, but he had to do it to survive. Grid took an intermediate strength and agility potion, which increased his stats. In the next 5 minutes, he ended up spending 24,000 Korean won, but it seemed to have an effect. He was very fast now, but if they were attacked at the same time, there would still be too many. He needed to recover from the leg first, so he had to buy time until he could take another health potion. Taking advantage of the fact that the bandits were being provoked, he counterattacked treacherously, finishing off one of them in the confusion. Grid took his second healing potion and leveled up 3 more levels to defeat the enemy. The leader was very angry at the protagonist's dirty tricks, so he attacked mercilessly. But Grid was now at level 11, much faster than before. However, he forgot that there were 3 of them and received an unexpected attack. The elder was very worried. Grid tried to gain more time to take another potion, but was grabbed by a henchman. He was finished again, but managed to spot armor on the first floor, so he got rid of what was holding him and launched the arrow as a distraction. He ran up the stairs and asked the old Khan if he wanted to protect his forge, to which the old man affirmed. Then, Grid would borrow the armor. The worried elder shouted that equipment couldn't be used. The henchman caught up to Grid, but he had already equipped his armor and, just before the bandits could finish him off, he asked if they had heard the word surrender and struck them down, earning over 15,000 experience points, reaching level 21, and completing the mission. His affinity with Khan reached its peak, and the exhausted elder climbed the stairs to check on the boy. He was surprised to see that the protagonist could use those items, the armor called Valhalla and the sword, a copy of Dane's Sleeve, both of unique rank with high usage restrictions and created by Albatin. The protagonist could use them as a descendant of Pagma, surprising the old Khan, who fainted. Grid was worried because the elder had another mission for him, but he fainted. In another part of the city, in a luxurious mansion, the owner, Mr. Valmont, seemed agitated when he found out that the bandits they had sent to force the blacksmith to sign the contract had disappeared after receiving payment. The man apologized, as he had recommended those mercenaries, but the mansion owner, Mr. Valmont, seemed cruel and demanded that he sell his family as slaves to repay the money. After that, he expelled the man and asked his strategist, named Rabbit, what had really happened. Rabbit mentioned that the men had entered the blacksmith shop but disappeared after entering. As for the old Khan, he was taken to a clinic by a young man. Valmont wanted the blacksmith shop and was selling cheap weapons just to put Khan out of business. They were about to acquire the blacksmith shop, but they failed. Rabbit was sent to investigate who the young man was and put in charge of obtaining the blacksmith shop. After this episode, Grid happily had breakfast, watching television. He had reached level 21 and was about to receive more missions from Khan. Perhaps even the armor and swords he had used would be some reward, just like his failure sword. The other 2 items were of unique rank, with high usage requirements and could not be traded. Grid left the old man in a clinic and hoped he would recover soon. Later, Grid returned to Satisfy, reappearing in front of the clinic. Khan was happy to see him. The old man seemed to have recovered. He thanked the protagonist for helping him, but before leaving, they had to pay a gold coin, as the old man was out of money. Grid paid, and the old man didn't know how to thank him, as he couldn't give the armor. They were family relics. He explained that Valhalla and Ice Sleeve were weapons created by his grandfather, Abatino, and no one could use them. 130 years ago, someone recognized their value, Pagma. Abatino knelt before Pagma and asked him to use them in battle, but Pagma refused, saying that one day the rightful owner would appear. Grid was able to use them. How did he do it? He asked Grid. Then it was his chance to obtain the items, so he took it and mentioned being a descendant of Pagma. The old Khan was moved to hear this. Another mission appeared for Grid, with which he could obtain the sword as a reward. Grid was very disappointed, but the old man needed proof. It was a great coincidence. Just like his descendants, they met. The old man took out alcohol to celebrate, but Grid took it from him, as Khan couldn't drink anymore. At that moment, Rabbit entered on behalf of the Marrow Company. Grid took the opportunity to store the bottles in the inventory and sell them. It seemed that this time they only wanted to talk. Khan couldn't pay a debt of 600 gold coins owed to the company, but he also didn't want to sell his building. They proposed a blacksmith competition, a Marrow Company blacksmith against the old Khan. It was clearly a trap, because they had certainly found a better blacksmith than his old one. But the old man accepted the duel on the condition that his successor would fight, as he was already old and wouldn't be able to compete. With this excuse, he ended up presenting the protagonist as his successor. Grid quickly rejected the idea, but was interrupted by another mission. If he won the duel, he would obtain 600 gold coins, equivalent to 720,000 Korean won. Grid quickly changed his mind, murmuring that he would crush them all. They reached an agreement and would soon provide more information and the location. Grid had no problem protecting the blacksmith shop, as he would earn 600 gold coins. After accepting the competition, Grid had a mission with a reward of gaining 500 reputation points in the new city, increasing affinity with the residents, and the 600 gold coins. However, if he failed, the protagonist's reputation would plummet to the minimum, and Old Khan would be forced to hand over his blacksmith shop to the Marrow Company. In the protagonist's thoughts, he already visualized his victory. I am a legendary blacksmith capable of crafting epic items. This competition will be no problem, thought the excited Grid. His thoughts were interrupted by the Old Khan, who brought weapons to train the protagonist's forging skills. Grid asked the old man why he didn't report the extortion he suffered from the Marrow Company. Khan replied that the Lord was also part of the scheme, receiving bribes from the company. Grid proposed to directly contact Count Stein, as Winston was part of his territory. However, the old Khan also tried and failed, as the Lord always interfered. The only viable solution was to win the competition. So, Grid asked the old man to trust him, as he would not disappoint him. The emotional old man agreed, and the image of his deceased son came to mind, as the resemblance to Grid was inevitable. In fact, Grid was just forcing him to accept the mission, but the old Khan reminded him a lot of his grandfather, both in attitude and vocabulary. Therefore, he would strive to the utmost for the competition after playing all night. Grid emerges from his capsule. Playing Satisfy was different for Grid than for the blacksmith Smith, but even though he was so old, he retained extraordinary skills like those of an advanced blacksmith. Grid wanted to learn from him, but what am I thinking? He corrected himself. The drowsy adventurer Grid went to have breakfast with his parents, who were very happy to spend more time with their son lately. But Grid suddenly asks about his grandfather. His parents are shocked by their unfeeling son, who never cared about anyone, was starting to change for the better. The grandfather was fine. So, Grid proposes to visit them together soon. Meanwhile, at the Marrow Company, the owner throws food to Rabbit. Why do you do unnecessary things? Rabbit scolded, reprimanding the family strategist. The move Rabbit had made didn't make sense in Valmont's eyes. Rabbit explains the situation. The residents greatly respected the old Khan, so the Marrow Company had to create the impression that their skills were superior to Khan's. So, they gave him one last chance. This way, they will improve the company's image. A smile appeared on Valmont's face. This way, we can attract royal clients, and it wouldn't be so bad, exclaimed Valmont. But before that, he had to ensure that the rival couldn't win. Rabbit's investigations indicated that the boy representing Khan is an ordinary person with no reputation, so the company prepared a craftsman who would definitely win. Even if he was a nobody, the company had to send their best blacksmith. Meanwhile, at Khan's forge, a guest questioned Grid's appearance. Is it true that this boy took down Bale and his men? He looks more like a weak and innocent young man to me. Grid asked him to be more discreet if he was going to criticize him. Then, some concerned citizens entered the blacksmith shop. Old Khan, this announcement is all over the city, they exclaimed. Apparently, the Marrow Company had made the competition public and did it in a very friendly manner, because even if they won, the company was willing to let Khan continue working at the forge, so they tried to coexist with the residents of Winston. The citizens' view of the Marrow Company was starting to change, and they were willing to give Khan a chance, and the conditions were quite good in the eyes of the people. They seemed to respect the old Kansas. This thought is completely destroyed by Khan, who tears up the announcement, asking if they had forgotten that the company had monopolized the business, impoverishing the city of Winston. The citizens retract, as they had fallen for the Marrow Company's trick again. It seems that our protagonist had also been deceived by the company's intentions. At this moment, a stranger interrupts Grid's thoughts. According to what I heard, the Marrow Company bought and traded the residents' lands. Grid realizes something that the rest couldn't see. According to the mark on his head, this person was another user. The stranger continued with his speech. The company offered to buy the forge, but you decided to stay for your personal interest. The rest of the citizens immediately jumped to defend their blacksmith, but the player calmed them down. I'm not here to fight. The company's priority is obviously to make a profit, but they can create a symbiotic relationship. After all, the company cannot survive without the residents. This speech calmed the inhabitants, who discussed that if the company benefited, the city's situation would also improve. Grid was surprised. It completely changed the flow of the conversation. "Who is this boy?" Oldkin thought the young man was an interloper and asked for his name. The boy introduces himself as Yoroi. Ken agreed with Yoroi's speech. In the long run, it would be better to have a symbiotic relationship with the company. However, Winston was part of Stein County, which had a local statute called the People's Rights, which protected its inhabitants against external investors. After Khan's explanation, Yoroi realizes that the company ignored the will of Count Stein, monopolizing information and development. Therefore, the responsibility fell on the city lord. Khan was satisfied after making the young man understand the city's situation. After that, Yoroi volunteers to present to Count Stein the tricks of the Lord of Winston and the Marrow Company. Yoroi managed to capture the resident's expression with just his words. Grid wondered how he had managed to do that. He had not received a mission from the residents of Winston, but he himself forced the residents to give him the mission to deliver the message to the Count. Then, Grid stopped the player and asked directly, "I know you came from the Marrow Company. Why did you change sides?" Instead of answering, Yoroi showed the mission he obtained from the people of Winston. He had to escape from the Marrow Company and reveal the situation to Count Stein, but the surprising thing was the rewards. He would obtain the title of Apostle of Justice, maximizing his affinity and reputation in Winston, in addition to receiving a gift from Count Stein. The jealous protagonist asked him to teach him how he got such a good hidden mission. Yoroi has no problem speaking the truth, the freedom that exists in Satisfy. If you actively communicate with the NPCs, you can obtain related missions. It's a method that we, the old players, know very well, so it's normal that you don't know it, explained the adventurer. But the embarrassed Grid revealed that, despite being a very experienced player, he was totally unaware of this trick, which made Yoroi burst into laughter. "You are very funny. Let's be friends," he proposed amidst laughter, but Grid was very embarrassed, so he immediately disconnected to avoid further embarrassment. Yoroi hoped he wasn't angry. However, he had to hurry to complete the new mission. Despite playing 18 hours a day since the game's release, he was only at level 127, all because of his class called Speaker. With this class, the only way to attack is with a skill called Malicious Tongue. Compared to other classes, it is much more difficult to level up due to limited weapons, low health, reduced abilities, and the lack of escape techniques, which complicated the gameplay. Nevertheless, he needed to complete this mission and obtain the new title that would boost his statistics. He needed to traverse the castle to speak with Count Stein. He tried to talk to the guards to deceive them, but received no response. That's when someone spoke to him from behind. It was the strategist Rabbit. He had to report after instigating the inhabitants. Rabbit questioned what he was doing there, and Yoroi had to use his persuasion skill to explain that he was just strolling around while thinking about how to instigate the citizens. Rabbit mentioned that they had underestimated Yoroi's abilities or perhaps were being betrayed. Yoroi wondered why his persuasion skill didn't work. Rabbit revealed that he was prepared for betrayal and ordered Yoroi to be arrested. The player tried to escape, but the guards captured him. He drew a dagger to defend himself, but was repelled. His only option was to disconnect, but when he gave the command, a window appeared indicating that it was not possible. Rabbit revealed that he was responsible for neutralizing the disconnection spell and that if the player died, he would be revived. Then they would imprison him in the castle. Yoroi was given a new mission. After a prolonged wait, he would be imprisoned in a castle, with no possibility of escape, but if he could last for 50 consecutive hours, he would be rescued by the Apostle of Justice. This was a long time because the maximum time Yoroi had spent playing was 20 hours, the limit of the capsule, as if you played for more than 20 hours, the capsule itself would expel you from the game, giving you a penalty of 6 hours without being able to connect to the device. It was very dangerous. However, Yoroi was a man without a girlfriend, job, or anything else that could interrupt him. If he put the capsule in trance mode, maybe he could resist the full mission time, he thought. Yoroi couldn't fail this mission, which is why he ended up accepting it, activating a timer. Now it was impossible to turn off the capsule from the outside, and if you tried to force it, they would also send a security team to protect the capsule. His only hope was to wait for the Apostle of Justice, who would follow him throughout the game. Satisfy had 2 billion players, making it essential for the game to be free of bugs and errors. In the central offices of the Satisfy group, the head developer was notified that Mission B408 had been activated. The president granted permission to send agents to the player's location in case of emergency. Mission B408 is a hidden grade, and the reward for completing it is a second class. However, it is very risky, as the player must remain in the game for a long time. The developers discussed the mission. The player, whose real name is Su Roy, 25 years old, is a player from Mongolia, which is incredible, as only 3% of the Mongolian population plays Satisfy. The head of the operations team detailed a user report about his current speaker class, with low battle strength, still managing to reach level 127, mostly completing missions. The president requested communication with the manager of the Mongolia branch, who was present at the meeting, and stated that the situation was under control, with real-time monitoring and medical personnel ready for any eventuality. The Mongolia manager also communicated that the country's government was aware and willing to collaborate but suggested that the news be released to the media, as the first player with 2 classes would be Mongolian, which could boost the market in the country. The directors and the team discussed the idea, which is a great opportunity to develop the game in Mongolia, although some personnel considered the idea too absurd, as it would have the opposite effect in case of mission failure. Then, a director expressed that they didn't need to worry too much. It was an easy mission to complete by design, as long as the boy didn't leave the game. Then, he asked about the success rate, revealing the leader the data from the reports. This surprised the entire team, as it was very low, only 9%? They asked in disbelief. There must be a mistake, as there is a hidden NPC in the underground prison. This was the Apostle of Justice, and by showing him the mission information and Winston's situation, he would rescue him. This moment was interrupted by the president's laughter, who realized something that the rest didn't see. There was a variable in the way, as it was assumed that Yu Roy should only share the information with the Apostle of Justice, but he revealed the information to another user. Who was the player? Meanwhile, our cheerful protagonist cried drunkenly at a street post. How could he have betrayed him like that? Oldkin gave him such a good mission to a stranger, even when I paid for the doctor. He vented. Then he arrived home at 1 in the morning, so he couldn't make noise. He should let us know if he's going to be out so late. Apparently, Grid's sister was waiting for him, worried because no one was in the capsule, but then she noticed the smell of alcohol emanating from her brother. Drunk Grid was happy that his sister was worried about him, but she told him to take a shower and go to bed, as it was clear that Grid was not in his best state. Returning to the Satisfy offices, a director expresses that it's not possible to complete this mission. The president soothes the disappointment of one of the directors, but even if he wasn't the Apostle of Justice, they still had the Grid, a new variable in the game. This didn't cheer up the director, as the player in question was only level 21. Even after obtaining a legendary class, they had wasted many resources on this user, and no one believed the mission could be accomplished. But the president seemed to have something in mind. The other director continued to disdain Grid. The only things he did after obtaining the legendary class were to create epic-grade arrows and receive a mission, although he hadn't shown any results. The president found Grid's actions very amusing. Here it is explained that currently in Satisfy, there are only 3 users of epic class. One of them was recently revealed, Blood Warrior, but the other 2 users are still a mystery to the public. The first user to obtain the epic grade class had not yet been identified, while the second user revealed himself to maintain his 7th place in the rankings. For this reason, the Satisfy community has been debating what the other 2 epic grade classes are and, above all, who was the first player to achieve an epic class. Remember that they still don't know that the protagonist has achieved an even higher grade class, the legendary class. Meanwhile, in the Aquero dungeon, some players try to recruit another player. Join our group. If you join, we will give you all the loot. The girls in the group thought they were going too far and that the men were very stupid, as all the men were drooling over a girl since she arrived. The player introduced herself as Euphemy and exclaimed that she would join the guild with the strongest players, then asked them to show their powers. This proposal further excited the men, but they were interrupted by a monster's cry, an opportunity they would take to show their skills. We will be the only ones to have Lady Euphemy, exclaimed a group. The users began to use their most powerful abilities in order to impress the player, finishing off the monsters. However, in Euphemy's eyes, they were very average abilities, a thought that was interrupted by an ability behind her. She heard a loud bang caused by someone's ability. Who is this user? Asked the girl. It was a user with a very powerful ability, perfect for defeating Piero, thought the player. Then she activated her duplication ability, and windows appeared indicating that the level 3 Frenzy Vortex ability had been successfully duplicated. This ability generated a vortex for 5 seconds, causing a lot of damage per second. After duplicating it, She could use this ability once and keep it in her arsenal until she used it. Here her identity is revealed, Euphemina, level 90, also known as Duplicator. The user asked if she would join their group after such a display of power, but as she turned around, they realized that the player had disappeared. She was somewhere else. She had prepared for 63 days for this S-class mission. Her mission indicated that she had to defeat a traitor named Piero and, as a reward, obtain the title of Vengeance Agent, which came with very interesting abilities. But if she lost, she would lose 2 levels. Euphemina was ready to start the mission, so she opened the door, concerned about the powerful NPC she would have to fight. Inside was the strongest knight in the Empire, Piero. Piero noticed the intruder as the player prepared to complete the mission. Spears fell from the sky onto her. Euphemina used an ability called Tartan and summoned a kind of golem. It was the most powerful defensive ability, known only by the first place in the Guardian Knight's ranking. The player could use the duplication ability 3 times a day. After copying an ability, she stored it in her repertoire and could use it once. The player spent 2 months copying the abilities of the top-ranked players, so she currently had 50 high-level abilities in her list. Although she could only use them once, they were very powerful abilities. "It's more than enough to finish this," exclaimed the player. And here is when she reveals that she is the first user of an epic grade class. Euphemina used another ability on Piero, which generated a great impact. But it wasn't enough. Piero resisted. Then the player chained the spell she had recently copied, generating a huge explosion, but she was sure he was still alive, so she continued chaining powerful abilities, one after another, causing great damage to the dungeon. The girl wondered if she had managed to defeat him, but she hadn't received the mission completed notification yet, so the NPC was still alive after using so many high-level skills. She had consumed a lot of mana, so she used the levitation ability. Now she needed to keep her distance to recover her mana with potions, but her thoughts were interrupted by a quick counterattack from Piero. How was it possible that he was completely unscathed? Piero was about to finish her off, but Euphemina quickly responded with another ability, one that generated illusions in the opponent. Euphemina took the opportunity to descend and recover, as she had saved this ability for an emergency. She thought she was trapped in the illusion, so now she could recover her mana with potions to counterattack with more skills. But some windows warned the player of the danger due to excessive use of skills. Your physical abilities have decreased, you cannot use skills for a while, all your attributes have decreased by 50%. What an inconvenient moment, just when she was about to complete the mission. However, she couldn't give up. There was still some time until Piero could recover. But when she looked up at the sky, she was surprised. Piero had broken free from the illusion and was now looking at her. He's a monster, thought Euphemina. He wasn't strong enough, so she gave up the mission, losing 2 levels in the process and disappointing Asmal's trust. She had wasted 2 months duplicating skills in vain. She was very angry, as she had been so close. Then, an NPC appeared. "Are you Miss Irina?" "I bring a message for you," said the NPC. "A message?" asked the player. "We would like you to take on a task," exclaimed the NPC. So, she received a mission. The player was not at all motivated after losing to Piero, but upon reading the mission, she changed her mind. If she completed the mission, she would obtain the title of competitor, which came with interesting statistics and abilities. Furthermore, they called her Irina, among the many nicknames she had. Irina was what she used to create objects, so she accepted the mission. She had to represent the company Mero in a competition to defeat Khan's successor. Returning to the protagonist, Khan asked him to stop grumbling, but Grid was still annoyed because the old man had given such a good mission to a stranger before him. The elder explained that the company was watching them, so Yuroi was the most suitable for the task. Furthermore, he couldn't put his young successor in danger, as the elder Khan thought of Grid as his own son and therefore could not continue living if something happened to him. These words motivated Grid to continue training for the competition against Mero. The competition would be in 2 days, so both Khan and Grid were very excited. If Grid repeatedly used his ability, it would constantly improve. He could feel that his movements were becoming more precise and efficient. Grid didn't stop creating rare and epic class items, improving both his statistics and his reputation, as well as continuing to accumulate dexterity and persistence statistics. The protagonist thought that the feeling of improvement was absolutely thrilling. After a long day of training, the protagonist was exhausted and decided to review his statistics to see how much he had improved. However, upon review, his blacksmithing skill and blacksmith's breath were still at level 1 and around 10%. Still, regardless of his statistics, Grid felt that he was improving, not to mention that he had gained 130 additional statistics points for creating items. Grid thought of assigning all the statistics to dexterity to win the competition, but he remembered his battle with the collectors, so he decided to distribute the statistics, 70 in dexterity and 60 in endurance. After improving his endurance, his health points also increased. His statistics were very positively distant from those of a level 21, they were more comparable to those of a level 75. Now that he had the descendant class of Pakma, he could continue to improve, and Grid was willing to make an effort in the competition. He would reap all the fruits of his effort. The next day, at the central stadium of Winston, the square was filled with users and NPCs who had come to see the competition. Users were surprised by the large number of NPCs at the site. Apparently, they were residents who had come to support Kan's blacksmith shop. All the inhabitants encouraged the protagonist. Grid's appearance and his low-level equipment disappointed the players who had come to see a high-level competition. The company Marrow was confident in their victory. The competition presenter announced the representative of the Marrow Company, who was Irina. She was very beautiful, so she quickly won the hearts of the players in the audience. Irina blew a kiss to the stands, thanking for the support. Grid thought she was beautiful, but after seeing Yura, she didn't even come close to the beauty of Ranker 5. Furthermore, Grid still had the support of the residents of Winston, or maybe not. Grid was very disappointed with the people who were defending him, but the presenter asked him to stand up. Irina introduced herself to Grid and hoped to have a good competition, but the protagonist quickly put her in her place. "You're not my type, so don't play with me, little girl," he said. "Are you being so rude to a beauty like me?" responded the offended Irina. "You're beautiful, but a girl like you shouldn't go around calling herself beautiful," retorted the protagonist. No man had been able to resist Irina's charms before. She was very angry and was going to humiliate him in front of everyone. Irina asked not to be called a girl, as she was already 20 years old, but Grid put her in her place again. "I'm too old for this," he said. The host kicked off the competition with today's theme, a dagger. They had to produce one within a time limit of 3 hours, and the best dagger would win the competition. Irina was very confident that she could win, but the only thing that worried her was the difficulty of the mission, as it was the first time a mission appeared to her as of unknown difficulty. This was because the rival's skills had not yet been revealed. Nevertheless, she decided not to worry, as her plan remained the same. When she started forging, she would duplicate his skill. However, when she looked at Grid, she was very surprised. If they had the same skills, the luckier person would win, but when she looked at Grid, she was very surprised. If they had the same skills, the one with the best equipment would win, which drastically increased their chances. So, Irina pulls out an epic-class hammer with which she would defeat Grid, in addition to activating another ability she had, observation. However, when she observed Grid, she drew a blank. Grid asked why she was looking at him, but the observation ability did not work on Grid, as the level of the ability was very low. "This is impossible," exclaimed Irina, as she had the observation at level S and even managed to copy abilities from an advanced blacksmith when she was at level C. Was he a master blacksmith? "It can't be," she exclaimed. "In the world of blacksmiths, there are only intermediate blacksmiths, but there's no way my ability could fail." So, she thought there was only one explanation. Did he also have an epic class? But she dismissed that answer. That can't be. Agnes Katz and I are the only epic class users. So, was he a unique class user? Irina wondered. She didn't know, but the only thing she was clear about now was that if things continued like this, she was going to lose. So, she quickly called Rabbit, asking for Grid's mentor to also participate in the competition. This proposal surprised Rabbit, but they had to do whatever it took to win. So, they explained the situation to the host, who quickly called Kan to participate. Thus, Irina would face a 2-on-1 situation. Back to Grid, he thought he was being underestimated, but the Elderkin was grateful for the opportunity to participate alongside the blacksmith he respected to defend his forge. Grid also became emotional and started working alongside Kansas. This was seized by Irina, who focused on the Elderkin to copy his skills, satisfactorily obtaining advanced craftsmanship, the blacksmith at level 2, being able to use it once during the competition. Irina thought she would have a similar level to Grid's, so now she had to work on her dagger and leave the rest to luck. After a while, Irina realized they were still working on the blade, while she had already finished that part. On Grid's side, the blacksmith's patience was activated, improving his blacksmith statistics. Everything was going well, and he had the old Can by his side. Everything was perfect, so the blacksmith's talent was also activated, improving the dagger's statistics. However, Rabbit seemed to have noticed something. Meanwhile, for Grid, there was only one thing left: to use a minotaur horn to create the hilt. They had spent a lot of gold on this resource. Then, Grid heard the host's reaction. Irina had finished forging her dagger, just like her master. It has a wonderful aspect. This masterpiece was completed in less than 3 hours, exclaimed the host. Grid was surprised. The girl hadn't been boasting. She was really very talented. The host proceeded to show the weapon's statistics. It had fabulous statistics. It was an epic-class weapon with over 120 attack points and the probability of enchanting the rival. The requirements to use the dagger were to have over 100 levels, have over 200 agility points and 30 intelligence, in addition to having intermediate dagger mastery. The results are clear, exclaimed the host. Grid, on the other hand, couldn't afford to be distracted. The company owner was impressed with the young lady's dagger. Ken was also impressed. The girl's skills for her age, but she was no match for Grid. It was then that Grid finished his dagger. The only thing that worried him was that the audience wouldn't have a heart attack after seeing his dagger. However, the arena was interrupted by guards, who approached the protagonists and arrested Grid, on the charge of cooperating with the traitor Uroi. Both the elder Can and the residents of Winston were surprised. They arrested Uroi? They wondered, confused. Valmont, on the other hand, showed indifference. This wretch is behind it all. He knew he couldn't win, so he mobilized his guards, thought Kansas. Grid, on the other hand, denied working with Uroi, as that damn man had stolen a mission from him. Rabbit, on the other hand, was glad to have mobilized the guards in time. I've seen all kinds of objects during the 20 years I've worked with the company, but Irina's dagger can't rival this object. We've lost, thought Rabbit. Even the grumpy Valmont could appreciate how magnificent Grid's dagger was. The results were being announced, and they would definitely lose the support of the public in this situation. However, the audience would be more than convinced if they were told that Irina's dagger was the winner. So, Rabbit hides Grid's dagger so that its statistics are not seen, but he would remember the blacksmith's name. With these skills, it wouldn't be absurd to call him the best blacksmith on the continent, he thought. Then, Irina approached to see the dagger. What a magnificent object! If we had finished the game, I would have lost. However, Irina fulfilled the requirements of her mission, so she asked for the reward, to which the strategist agreed. Irina completed her mission, earning 1,500 gold, the title of competitor, as well as statistics and skills. She obtained the dice throw ability, which would cause a beneficial or detrimental effect, depending on the number that came up, and could be used on both allies and enemies. Irina thought they had accused Grid without reason, as he seemed innocent and confused. However, it was necessary for them to win. He has the worst of personalities, but I would like to know his true identity, the player thought. Then, the NPC Rabbit reveals that he noticed Irina's poor skills at the blacksmith, but her movements were just like Khan's, so she must have some ability to copy. Irina was impressed by the NPC's abilities, but Rabbit changes the subject. One day, Count Stein will stop the Marrow Company due to his greed, so he was thinking of leaving the company and seeking another opportunity for success. After seeing Grid's abilities, she thought that Can's blacksmith could be that opportunity. Grid could rival the rest of the companies just with his skill. Is this player really that amazing? Thought Irina. Then, Rabbit proposed another task to Irina. Would you help me rescue that man? Exclaimed Irina. Then, a new window appeared with the details. She would have to help Rabbit rescue Grid. If she succeeded, she would receive 5,000 gold coins and maximum affinity with Rabbit and the residents. But if she failed, she would lose 2 levels and the NPC would disappear along with the future missions he could grant. Who was this guy? Thought Irina. As soon as she related to him, she obtained a title and an S rank. Should she help him? Exclaimed the player. Meanwhile, at the blacksmith, the residents were thinking of rebelling. We can't leave everything in the hands of Grid and Uroi, they lamented. They were going to protect their future themselves, but the emotion is interrupted by an arrow. Balmont had predicted a rebellion. The citizens were very angry, but Balmont was going to subdue them. But the NPC's goal was nothing other than Can's blacksmith. You are demons, thought Kansas. Then, they ordered to arrest Can as the leader of the rebellion. In another dark place in Satisfy, poor Yuroi was exhausted, praying for someone to rescue him. According to the data, his condition was unstable, so they had to disconnect him to ensure his safety. The game developers were discussing whether they should intervene. In the eyes of some developers, it was very dangerous to leave this to Grid, as he was a very low-level user and had just been arrested. The probability of success should be less than 9%. However, now Grid was closer to Yuroi. There was still hope. This player had a lot of persistence. He will definitely do something. We will bet the remaining 2 hours on him, decided the director of the Mongolia branch. In the dungeon of Winston's castle, the guards were trying to extract information from Grid. "Fool, if you don't answer my questions, you will be executed immediately," shouted an unhappy guard. "I don't care," replied our protagonist, even more stubborn. "You have no courage. You are manipulators," shouted Grid to vent. But in reality, if he died, the protagonist would reappear at Khan's blacksmith. However, the other guard calms his companion. "Calm down, Leo. You know he has an immortal body. Let's take him to solitary confinement." This was a terrible situation for Grid. If they imprisoned him, Khan would be in danger, and he couldn't play if they kept him in prison. "What a big problem," shouted Grid. Then, the guard orders to imprison Grid until he is willing to talk. Grid couldn't express his discontent, as he was already ready to talk. Grid is arrested. But then he receives an S-rank mission, Apostle of Justice. He had to rescue Yuroi in less than 7 hours. As a reward, he would obtain the title of Apostle of Justice, along with other benefits. Grid had seen this mission before. They were the same rewards that Yuroi showed him. Grid was imprisoned, but there was no option to refuse the mission. "Why are they doing this to me?" cursed Grid. 3 hours had already passed, and Grid's situation was the same. Our protagonist wanted to strike the goddess of fortune, but this thought is interrupted by a familiar voice. "Grid, where are you?" It was Irina. "What is this girl doing here?" "It doesn't matter now. She is my last hope," thought Grid. He didn't like her, but he only had 2 hours left, so the protagonist made some noise to get her attention. Irina noticed the sound, but was startled to see a bloody and gagged Grid. Irina was happy to find Grid and was willing to free him from the cell. But first, she would return his dagger. "I return this to you. You put in a lot of effort," expressed Irina as she returned his dagger. Grid thanked her for the gesture. Maybe she's not such a bad girl, thought Grid. However, Irina had a request in return. She wanted Grid to make a magical orb capable of containing the greatest amount of power possible. Grid had never forged anything like it, but he would accept for now. However, the player had one more request. She wouldn't call her girl again, as her name was Euphemina. Irina was a nickname. Grid thought there were too many conditions, but he had no choice. Finally, Grid was free. But why would he help Irina? And how had she managed to get this far being a blacksmith? Then, the user reveals that she is not a blacksmith. She confesses that she has the hidden class duplicator, and that during the competition, she had copied Khan's abilities. Grid is surprised, as currently there are only 3 hidden classes in Satisfy. But why would Euphemia reveal this to him? Euphemina confesses that sooner or later they would have met, and she also knew that Grid also had a hidden class of at least a unique grade. This surprised the protagonist. Could he have fallen for him? He asked the protagonist directly. "Stop talking nonsense," the player replied, because even though she didn't know Grid's class, they now had to fight seriously as they had brought the entire army. Irina had already finished off 100 of them, but she needed Grid's help to finish off the rest. Grid couldn't help in combat as he only had his dagger, but upon seeing the weapon statistics, he had a pleasant surprise. Apparently, the weapon was of unique grade, with high attack damage, the possibility of instantly finishing off the enemy, and the abilities of explosive wind and swift movements. Additionally, the dagger granted agility to the wielder. It was an incredible weapon, but the usage requirements were absurd. The player would need to be above level 180, have nearly 500 points in agility statistics, and master advanced level dagger skills. Grid hadn't been able to see the weapon statistics as he was arrested before doing so. Then, 2 windows appeared, one being a weapon created by Grid, with a 100% understanding, so the only penalty that applied to the weapon for not meeting the requirements was a 20% reduction in damage and half the effects. Grid was disappointed to receive penalties, even as the creator. But Irina was truly surprised. How could he use this dagger? Are you part of an assassin's guild? She asked, bewildered. Because, as a general rule in Satisfy, no user can use an item if they do not meet the requirements, even if they are the creator. Grid was an exception, thanks to his descendant class of Pagma. Irina was surprised that the protagonist had as much mastery of weapons as advanced blacksmithing. He must have seen the dagger's statistics, she thought, but they were interrupted by a horde of knights who attacked the protagonist mercilessly. In response, Grid used the explosive wind ability of the dagger, finishing off an entire group of guards. Euphemina applauded, surprised by Grid's abilities, but the protagonist shouted not to just stand there. The player revealed that she only needed to rescue him, and that her abilities had a small cost. Grid couldn't waste time, as another group was coming after them, and there was just over an hour left to complete his rescue mission. Then, Grid revealed to Euphemina that they needed to rescue someone else, but the player told Grid that she had already rescued Can, who was coming here. Was he also captured? Grid wondered. It was a relief to hear that, but I need to save a guy named Yuroi, the protagonist revealed. Irina wondered who he was, but Grid also didn't know, as he had only seen him once. Euphemia didn't want to continue getting involved, but Grid was forced to take on this mission, so he called the girl annoying. This irritated Euphemia. I already told you not to call me girl, the player shouted, while launching a powerful ability that grazed our protagonist. Irina had massacred a complete group of guards, causing the soldiers to retreat. This speed without chanting was comparable to Yura, thought Grid. I'll let it go this time, but I really would love it if you didn't call me girl, a grumpy Euphemina said in a challenging tone. Grid could only apologize for his mistake. How far should we go? Isn't B3 the lowest floor? Grid asked, bewildered. But the player replied that there was a lower B4 floor, so they only had to follow her, as there was just over an hour left to complete their mission. Irina revealed that someone she trusted had told her about the existence of the B4 floor. The guards were following them closely, so Grid quickened his pace, although the player seemed to have seen something. It was a flower in such a dark place. Grid asked her not to pick it up, as it was a trap. Fortunately for our protagonists, the traps were visible. However, they couldn't resist picking it up. Grid tried to maintain composure, but was attacked by another trap. Irina's excuse was hunger, but Grid wasn't convinced, as she picked up another flower. They were activating all the dungeon traps. How many times do I have to tell you there are traps? Grid said, his patience exhausted. Irina didn't want to do side missions, as she only needed to rescue Grid. At that moment, they were caught up by the guards, and then Grid took a shortcut to get there first, asking Euphemina to take care of the guards in some way. Finish them off, as I have to keep working. If you use fire in such a confined space, we'll all end up burned, the player replied. Grid thought Irina had an incredible ability. Thanks to her, he didn't need to watch his back. Euphemina, in turn, continued to finish off the guards, but they didn't end. She still had 11 abilities left over from Piero's mission. She didn't want to waste them on simple guards, as there were still the 5 Knights of Winston remaining, and she couldn't identify them among so many guards. However, she needed to buy time, so she would have to use some abilities, as she needed Grid to make an orb. Yuroi, on the other hand, was at his limit, so he spent his last strength to let out a shout. Grid recognized Yuroi's voice and ran to where it came from. Then, he came across a guard who introduced himself as Leo, a Knight of Winston. He had found out about their escape and knew that Grid would try to rescue Yuroi. Grid was worried, as the knights were around level 180. The knight targeted Grid and attacked him head-on. Grid, in turn, activated the blacksmith's wrath and the swift movement ability of the dagger at the same time, gaining an increase in agility. The knight begins with an attack. The protagonist narrowly manages to dodge, remaining very fast, thought Grid as he repelled the sword strike. Without the dagger, that attack would have finished him. The knight's pride was wounded. How could a simple blacksmith block his attack? Therefore, he makes use of his skilled fatal fire sword. This attack directly hits Grid, causing a total of 17,300 damage. Nevertheless, Grid manages to survive with his skill. A legend doesn't die so easily. He needed to recover as soon as possible with a potion to not die as stupidly as last time. Then the knight's attack ceased. He needed to finish off the guard, but the guard was destroyed by Irina's area fire attacks. Before dying, the dying guard asks Grid how he didn't lose, something that Grid mentions about not losing due to the vast difference in strength and abilities between them. Grid obtains the title of Night Slayer, in addition to obtaining the dungeon key and leveling up significantly. Currently, Grid has reached level 45. The protagonist manages to find Uroy's cell. Grid planned to attack him for stealing a mission, but Uroy was already on his last legs. Uroy was very surprised that his savior was Grid. So, he completes his mission, obtaining the secondary class of Companion of the Apostle of Justice. Uroy is truly grateful to Grid, as thanks to him, he gained the courage statistic and abilities that will help him in battle. In turn, Grid also completes his mission, acquiring the title of Apostle of Justice and the rewards that follow. Uroy, in turn, is very grateful to Grid, so he offers his loyalty and introduces himself as Dame and descendant of the Blue Wolf. Now, she would follow Grid to repay this debt. Grid thought he was crazy. Returning with Euphemina, she continued to defeat the guards that kept coming. The duplicator class may seem the best for copying the benefits and abilities of other classes, being able to defeat dungeon bosses alone with the right combination of skills. Returning to the duplicator class, an army of one man. However, she can only copy 3 skills per day and, in relation to her own class skills, has only 9 skills that are not useful for combat. Therefore, if a duplicator has a large supply of copied skills, she can become the strongest user. However, once she uses up all her skills, Euphemina would be in her weakest state. The guards were surprised that a simple player could defeat so many guards. Only the elite of the Winston Knights remained. Irina thought Grid should have been defeated by now. After hearing a loud explosion, even if he had managed to save Uroy, it wasn't certain that he would come to rescue her. The knights reveal that there are still guards of the Winston Lord at the entrance, in case Grid manages to escape. They had to finish as quickly as possible. And on the part of the player, she was in trouble. Only 3 advanced skills remained, but they were of the fire type, so she would be finished if she used them in a confined space. The knights advanced at the same time to finish off Irina, who managed to dodge the attack while cursing herself for trusting Grid. Then, the other guards simultaneously attacked to finish off the player. Irina makes use of her basic skills and summons a shield, but it is destroyed by the knight. The blow was cushioned, but she received a lot of damage. The guards celebrated their victory. It seemed she was powerless. Now, she would avenge the hundreds of knights she had defeated. Irina was in trouble. She only had to use the skill she had recently gained, although it only had a 50% chance of being beneficial. She had to leave it to luck. Euphemina was about to use dice roll when she hears a familiar voice. "You are shameless. How can self-proclaimed knights attack a girl in a group?" The knight stops his attack. It was our protagonist. "Grid, you should have come earlier," Euphemina said, relieved. The knights were astonished. If he was there, it could only mean that the knight Leo was defeated. Grid reveals that he defeated a certain Leo in an honorable one-on-one. This, along with the threatening aura he emanated, made the soldiers retreat. Euphemina was surprised. The NPCs instinctively backed off when the opponents were 30 or more levels higher than them. "How high is your level?" the user asked. He was a blacksmith, but they still had to be cautious, as he had defeated Leo and seemed very confident. The knights couldn't afford to make a misstep. "Step aside if you don't want to end up like Leo," Grid intimidated with a threatening tone. Uroy thought he looked pathetic the first time he met him, but now even the Winston Knights feared him. He must have an extremely high level. Grid is an amazing person, Uroy thought. Grid, on the other hand, enjoyed the feeling of superiority. He didn't think he could defeat them, but he had the powerful Irina by his side. The guards were now in trouble, being cornered against the stairs. They couldn't keep retreating. So, Grid started encouraging the player. "Come on, Euphemina, show them who's boss. Use your magic to annihilate them." "I can't," the player replied. This left Grid confused. "I can't defeat them," she revealed. Irina was also confused. Didn't you defeat a knight on your own? Do it again." Then, the guards began to counterattack. "Don't ignore us," one of them shouted as he advanced to attack. "Damn, I provoked them too much," thought the protagonist. Now, he was in trouble. However, Uroy threw himself to protect the protagonist. Uroy shouted in concern. Then the guard dropped his sword. He held his wrist. The blow was so strong. Grid was confused. How did he resist? "I'm fine," the adventurer replied. Thanks to the strong will skill he gained, Uroi could resist an attack for the next 10 seconds. Irina asked in disbelief how he blocked a knight's sword with just his body, but Grid didn't know either. "I have no idea. I don't know him very well, but it's not the time for questions. You two should escape." "Now," exclaimed Uroi. "I will hold them off. I owe you a lot." Euphemina felt bad for leaving him, but Grid saw an opportunity to escape. "Hold on as long as you can," the protagonist bid farewell. "If the opportunity arises, we will meet again," he exclaimed. "We won't let them escape so easily," the knights grumbled. Then, Uroi activated malicious tongue and began insulting the guards. The knight's statistics began to drop. It was the opportunity to test his new skill, Unyielding Justice. This attack inflicts 300% of Uroi's attack damage. It was a spectacle of lights, but it didn't really cause much damage to the knight, as Uroi's damage statistics were very low, even when increased by 300%. Exhausted, the player fell to his knees. He was going to be captured, but since he had completed his mission, he could log out. Finally, he could rest. He left the rest in the hands of the protagonist. Returning to the protagonists, they already visualized the exit door of the dungeon. Finally, they were free. Grid shouted freedom to the four winds, but Euphemina told him to shut up, as they were still in enemy territory. They had to leave the castle, but Grid was very out of breath. "I told you to shut up," Euphemina impatiently shouted. How could someone so stupid be more powerful than she thought? Then Grid asked, "Are these guys enemies too?" "They were the Lord's bodyguards who came with the Lord of Winston. To think that all these knights and soldiers were defeated," lamented the Lord. Grid blamed Irina. "This only happened because you were causing a scene." This made the player even more furious. The Lord, in turn, could not let them escape or he would report the corruption to Lord Stein. "Finish off the sinners," he ordered. "Take care of them," Euphemina said to the protagonist, frightened by the situation. Euphemina had to maintain her patience. "Are you really going to act like a weakling until the end?" she thought. But now that they were outside, she could make use of her fire abilities as much as she wanted. A swift attack brought down the Lord's bodyguards, causing him to fall backwards. Faced with such a display of power, it was impossible. All of his guards had been defeated with a single attack. However, Euphemina managed to release all her stress and asked the Lord to accompany them out of the castle. Grid, for his part, wished he never had to face such a terrifying player. Finally, they were truly free. "Great job," everyone shouted the strategist Rabbit. The Lord shouted for help. "I forgot about the company," Grid thought. But why was Euphemina speaking so casually with them? Right, they worked together. "Did they set me up in a trap?" Grid asked. Grid quickly checked his statistics to see if he could take on all of them. He now had 4 titles and luckily, the enemies were not very well equipped. He should increase his attack and defense with all the stat points he had gained. The protagonist spent 150 on strength and 90 on agility. There was no other option. After increasing his stats so much, the protagonist became too powerful, although he had not realized it yet. Because the total stat points of a level 45 are less than 500 points, but Grid's exceeded 1,300 points and, with the dagger equipped, his attack power surpassed level 100 of the fighter class. However, his expectations of fighting opponents so overwhelmingly superior made him feel weaker than he really was. "Rabbit, what are you doing?" shouted Lord Winston. "Rush and set me free," demanded the strategist. "I am no longer a mere member of the company," Rabbit revealed. Now they would punish Mr. and Balmont for their actions. Mr. reproached the betrayal, but as Rabbit was a merchant, he was acting with a benefit in mind. He had decided to bet on Grid. The protagonist had incredible skills, but Rabbit was going to help make the whole world know about him. Rabbit is truly willing to take Grid to the top. But they had to finish another pending matter as quickly as possible, so he would leave with Irina. "I will tell you the details after dealing with the mere company," Rabbit said. "I will definitely make you richer than you could have ever dreamed," Rabbit said before leaving. These words captivated Grid, but Euphemina caught his attention. "I hope you haven't forgotten the promise to forge me a uniquely rare orb," Euphemina said. Grid cheerfully replied, "I haven't forgotten. You just have to obtain the materials and the production process for me," Euphemia was very surprised that Grid had agreed so obediently, but in reality, Grid would obtain a completely free production method. I will contact you when I get the materials, Irina said goodbye. It was fun. See you. Once everything was finished, the protagonist decided to disconnect, as he was very tired. Finally, he could see the light at the end of the tunnel. I was going to be rich. Guys, if you don't want to miss the next releases, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It's very important for us, in addition to the comments, which generate engagement for the channel. I look forward to seeing you in the next nerd recap. Rabbit asked Irina why Grid was afraid of the player, but Irina reveals that in reality, he is absurdly powerful and was just playing with her. Euphemia reveals that she defeated a knight from Winston, surprising the strategist. It's stronger than a knight, he exclaimed, astonished. There couldn't be a blacksmith like this unless it was Pagma. Now everything made sense. He is definitely a descendant of Pagma. Now his plans wouldn't sound far-fetched at all. Although Rabbit's vision never happened, the Mere Company fell after the disturbances revealed to Count Stein. The Lord of Winston and Valmont were executed, and on Rabbit's part, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, as Count Stein did not forgive his actions in the company. It was a pity not to see Grid's achievements, but Rabbit knew that even without him, Grid would achieve great things. The people of Winston, for their part, would regain their original activity, while the bards told the epic story of how a young blacksmith saved his people from tyranny. It's a very entertaining story, said one person, upon hearing the adventure, while paying for the report. You say it's a new face in town, but the girl reveals that from now on they would see each other more often around the city, as she was none other than the daughter of Count Stein, who would designate his daughter Irene as the Lady of Winston. In the previous chapter, Grid managed to escape from the dungeon. Meanwhile, in the real world, it was news that a player from Satisfy had obtained 2 classes. In several countries, they discussed what the second class could be and how rare this feat is. Japan, for its part, was calm, as they already had a player of epic class and were confident of getting another with 2 classes. In this country, they looked down on Korea, as they only had Ayura at the top. In Korea, they described the characteristics of having 2 classes, being able to use more weapons and opting for more stats and skills. Additionally, upon leveling up, one would obtain double the stat points. Grid was tired of hearing about the new player with 2 classes. It's so broken, he thought. Who could the bastard be? The protagonist was jealous. At dusk, Grid reveals to his parents that he will not return to work. His father questions whether he is going to be unemployed forever. His sister, in turn, was once again disappointed. The mother reveals that Grid was deceived into joining a multi-level marketing company and had to pay a debt. But Grid responds that it is different this time. Then, the protagonist reveals that he is a great blacksmith in the game and that people will buy his weapons for a lot of real money. The father responds with a disappointed look. They were very disappointed that their son was a gaming addict. The father asks him to stop being foolish, grow up once and for all, and look for a job. Grid is very sad because his family does not trust him. Later, Grid was tired of his new job. The problem had always been money, so he was going to accept Rabbit's proposal. With the support of Rabbit and Khan, he could achieve results to show his parents. Grid returns to Khan's forge. The elder is happy to see him. Grid is also glad that the forge is reopening, but asks about Rabbit. Then, Elderkin hands a letter from Rabbit to the protagonist. In the letter, Rabbit explains that he was not forgiven for getting involved with the company. Still, he trusted that Grid could achieve great feats with his skills. He would be watching from afar, praying for his success. Apparently, the Count could not forgive all his actions and sentenced him to 10 years in prison. This was devastating news for the protagonist, as all his dreams and riches went down the drain. The elder tries to cheer him up with a proposal. He entrusted his forge to Grid. The protagonist was confused. He had never heard of a player becoming the successor of an NPC. It was surprising. But Grid imposes a condition. I will believe in you if you write a contract. Later, Elderkin delivers the contract and declares the protagonist as the successor of the forge. Grid was very happy, as one day the forge would be his. Then, Kim proposes to train a bit in forging, to which Grid happily agrees. Meanwhile, at the auction house, a user cannot find what she is looking for. She searches anxiously, asking how it is possible that Yafa's special arrows are not there. Normally, a blacksmith would create thousands of these arrows to sell, but this one sold only 99 and disappeared. Could he have already been recruited by a pack? Sadaka wondered. The rest of the users, surprised by the beauty of the pack captain Sadaka, Jishuka, the player, realizes they are talking about her and turns to intimidate them. She clarifies that she is the same Jishuka from previous chapters, although the menu has changed the character's design. Jishuka opens the clan chat and informs that if they do not find the blacksmith in less than a month, they will undergo hellish training. The only one excited about the training was Regis. There was not much information about the mysterious blacksmith, but they needed to locate him to strengthen the clan. Then, another member enters the game. Apparently, he found information online about a forging competition in a city called Winston. One of the participants managed to create an epic dagger in less than 3 hours. It was him. An epic object in less than 3 hours was something impossible, even for the best blacksmith in the ranking, Panmir. Jishuka gives the order to mobilize the entire clan to the city of Winston. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Satisfy, someone earns 500,000 points after defeating several enemies. He does not stop defeating enemies, gaining 600,000 experience. It was the Blood Warrior, the third epic class in the game. Katz had reached level 216 and was ranked 40th in the unified ranking. In real life, he was the second son of the owner of a Japanese conglomerate. Although he had quickly climbed the ranking thanks to his epic class, he had not been able to advance much in recent months, despite hunting more than ever. His older and younger brothers were gaining ground to be the successors, so he did not want to be a loser in the game and also needed to go to high-level hunting areas, as expensive potions were not a problem for him. However, his equipment was not up to par. Even with all the money in the world, there were no good items for sale. What were the blacksmiths doing? A month after the events in the village of Winston, in the capital of the Stein Kingdom, Euphemie was lost in her thoughts. She could not find the production methods for orbs, even after a month of searching. She had enough gold to buy them, thanks to the mission she completed, but she could not find the production methods anywhere. Then, the player notices something and shouts loudly, "Show yourself! I know you are there." Thanks to her class, she had high detection skills. She was being watched, even without revealing her name on the ranking list, but as a secret ranker. The player asks again for the person to show themselves. The stranger was surprised. A simple blacksmith managed to detect my presence? It was not possible. The manual introduces the unknown as Faker, a member of the Sadaka clan and the first place in the assassin ranking. The other clan members laugh at the player. The reputation of the Sadaka clan was suffering because of her. You lost your touch after reaching the top of the assassin ranking. Apparently, the Sadaka clan was gathering after obtaining information about the winner of the forging competition in Winston. The leader had asked them to follow her until she arrived. Faker had planned to watch her from a distance until the leader arrived, but he was detected, even while in level 7 stealth. Then, Irina decides to attack directly, launching a powerful strike that makes the Sadaka clan members stop following her, calling them perverts. Chain-linking with another high-level skill, the Sadaka clan members wonder how a blacksmith could use such advanced skills. She was not the blacksmith they were looking for. It was a trap from the clan that was also after the creator of the arrows. They wanted to distract him with false news. The Sadaka clan had been deceived. The assassin asks Irina which clan she belongs to. The player was tired, as all the men she had encountered lately were psychopaths, so she attacks with an electric skill. But Faker reveals that it is useless against him and, with a quick move, gets behind Irina and counterattacks with a kick. It was the first time Irina had been hit by a user since she became a duplicator. He was a powerful user. Then, the player also duplicates herself, surprising Irina. "It's over," she shouts. But Irina uses another skill, which eliminates the clones and summons the ancient Knight of the Queen, a familiar? The surprised assassin wonders how it was possible to summon a familiar without being a summoner. The knight delivers a powerful blow, which the assassin dodges. A knight was the perfect counterattack for an assassin who fights with stealth, he thought. If he could not fight the knight, he would attack the summoner. Faker throws magical daggers at the user, who responds with an assassin skill. How was this possible? The confused Faker wondered. Irina, in turn, had gathered many skills from top rankers during her search for the orb production method, so she was currently at her most powerful version yet. The knight delivers another blow, and Faker's companions decide to support him by attacking the knight. However, it was very powerful. Irina continues chaining skills and uses an attack called Dragon Claws, surprising the Sadaka clan, which takes a lot of damage from the attack. How was it possible that the girl had such an overwhelming advantage? Even facing 4 top rankers? Was it the absolute power that the clan had been looking for? Faker was finished. The explosion destroys everything at the site. Later, the leader and the other clan members arrive at the location. The surprised leader asks who they were fighting against, as everything was destroyed. A member explains that Irina single-handedly defeated the 4 clan members, including Faker, using skills from different classes. Perhaps she was a hidden class player. She had left the clan with a terrible image, so the leader orders them to find her immediately, and she will personally deal with Irina and her followers. As for Grid, the only thing he did during the last month was create items. Thanks to his training, he realized a few things. The first is that if he continues producing the same item repeatedly, he does not gain much experience. The second is that there are 2 conditions to create a high-level item. Use high-level materials or spend more time and effort with normal materials. And third, to work with heavy minerals, it takes not only dexterity but also strength and stamina. The protagonist decides to rest a bit. During this month, in addition to improving his stats, he also managed to raise legendary skills to level 2, enhancing the legendary blacksmithing and the legendary blacksmith's breath. On average, it took 6 hours to create an item, and he produced a total of 73 items, of which only 3 were epic. At least he had managed to get a list with the production method of many items delivered from Can to his successor. Now that Grid thought about it, he had not heard any news about the girl. During this last month, Grid was about to obtain a production method for a unique grade item completely free. Wait a moment, if I make the item and it results in a normal grade orb, I'm screwed, Grid thought as a chill ran down his body. Without a doubt, Irina would annihilate him. Then, someone enters the blacksmith shop, startling Grid. 2 players ask the protagonist if he was Can, but the elder introduces himself as Can, the owner of the blacksmith shop. The players ask the elder if he had a competition with a girl named Irina a month ago, to which the old man responds affirmatively. His companion asks the blacksmith if the girl was also a blacksmith. Did she really manage to create something truly useful? He asked the elder. He describes her as a formidable blacksmith. But who are you to intrude and ask about her? Ken asked. The other player throws another question. Was the Marrow Company the only group that intervened in the competition, or was there some other stranger? Grid wondered who these guys were to ask so many rude questions, as they were disrespecting the poor elder Kansas. Therefore, he asks the players to be kinder to the elder. The player asks the protagonist not to interfere in their matters, and they begin to argue among themselves. The companion reassures him, as he was very agitated since he learned of Faker's defeat. He proceeds to ask Can one last thing before leaving, if they knew anything more about Irina, but the elder says no. We only faced each other in a competition. How are we supposed to know anything about her? The elder replied. Since they did not know anything, the players left the place to ask elsewhere. Grid kicks them out, asking them never to return. Then, a customer asks Can for more items, as apparently, the items that Grid had forged had become very popular. This was a great opportunity for Grid, as the elder Can knew very well the value of the items he forged and negotiated for him. On the other hand, the auction houses had very high commissions. If it continued like this, he might get rich. But something continued to bother the protagonist. Most of the items he had forged were of normal grade. Perhaps the system was broken. In the group's operations center, another complaint email arrives for customer service. Apparently, Grid was complaining that the game was manipulating his probabilities, as he was a legendary blacksmith, but of the 73 items he forged in the last month, none were legendary. He only managed to create 3 epic items. Therefore, the only possible answer was that they were manipulating his chances. Support was tired of reading these emails, as the chances of creating legendary items would increase as he leveled up. Grid had a legendary class but was unaware of this fact. Still, the protagonist was a loser, as only 3 epic items came out of the 73 items he forged. It was normal to wonder why he was complaining. Grid was an icon of misfortune. According to his calculations, with the items he sold during the last month, he made a profit of just over $1,000 approximately, working 5 or 6 hours a day. If he worked all day, he could generate even more income. However, his parents forced him to find a job. He needed to sell his dagger to have an adequate income that would convince his parents, but he didn't know anyone with advanced dagger mastery. He would have to return to the employment office. Then, he was hit in the face by a flyer. It was for a rental establishment on promotion, offering a lifetime 30% discount. The fee cost about $5, so instead of going to the employment office, he would go to the capsule hotel to play in the morning and afternoon, and then play at home in the evening. Grid ran to the place. From now on, this place would become his new workplace. This was the day Grid would start working as a full-time blacksmith. Meanwhile, at Can's Forge, customers were interested in buying many more items. However, they were sold out due to the recent popularity that these items gained. They were more expensive than items of the same category, but still worth it, as their performance was 20% better. Grid worked all day, but it took time to create them. Apparently, everyone wanted to meet the master craftsman who produced these items, but Grid asked them not to reveal his identity. Many users gathered to discuss who the master craftsman could be, but no one realized that the novice hammering in the back was the person they were looking for. During the last week, Grid had been going to the capsule hotel, playing a total of 15 hours a day. Because of this, he doubled the number of items he could produce. This was his last great creation, a silver armor he forged using Can's production method. It cost 483 gold coins. I must clarify that 1 gold coin is worth about $1 in this manual. Therefore, the materials he used were around $500. It was the most expensive item he had produced so far. It took 20 hours because he didn't want a normal grade item. Now it was time to see his statistics. Grid prayed that it would be legendary grade, or at least unique grade, but upon seeing his statistics, he was disappointed as it was an epic grade item. Grid shouted from the bottom of his heart, but Elderkin tried to console him. "It's amazing. It's rated higher than what you would get by following my production method," said Kansas. Grid asked how much he could sell it for. Elderkin didn't know, so he could auction it off for the knights to bid on it. Can once saw a very good armor, but it didn't come close to the armor Grid had just forged. "I suppose I'll auction it," said the protagonist. Due to the legendary blacksmith's crafting and breathing skills, the armor statistics were 20% higher and had additional options. Most knights hovered around level 180, but perhaps this level 120 armor would catch their attention, thought the protagonist. The auction was in the castle, and it was a good opportunity for Grid, as this time they wouldn't charge commissions. If there were no commissions, it was the opportunity for Grid to reappear. Since the auction was in 2 days, Grid would take the time to create a few more items to auction. On the day of the auction, the protagonist was disappointed that most of the items he created in those 2 days were of common grade. Then, Elderkin handed him a talisman with which he could participate in the auction representing the blacksmith. Grid obtained the insignia of Khan's successor, and the old man wished him luck. Grid, in turn, expected nothing, as luck had never been his companion in this life, and he said goodbye to Khan. Here the manual explains that the purpose of the castle auction is not only to obtain good equipment for the knights, but also to use it as a means to find blacksmiths with excellent skills. For this reason, many blacksmiths gather in the castle lobby every year in the hope of being selected and gaining the rights to produce items for the lord. Grid was surprised by the immense number of blacksmiths present, both NPCs and players. The auction hostess announced that the event would start soon, so she asked the participants to set a minimum price for their items and submit their bids. Grid decided to submit the armor first, along with some epic-grade gauntlets he managed to create at the last moment. However, the protagonist didn't know what minimum price to set for his items. At that moment, a young man asked if he could help him with something. The player introduced himself as Stein. Grid thought he had heard that name before and commented that he was having trouble deciding the minimum price he would set for his items. Then, Stein asked if the master who sent it to Grid hadn't told him the price beforehand. Then, the player showed a mission, apparently having come to represent the blacksmith Radvan. Grid asked, confused, if he wasn't coming to sell his items, but those of his master? Then, the young man revealed that the quality of the items sold at this auction was very high, so he couldn't sell his works. Then, Stein showed the weapon of his master, a great sword of level 190. He was very happy and proud of his master's work. Then, Grid thought it was normal to complete NPC missions and gain production methods. Still, he was surprised by Stein's happiness upon seeing a rare category item. Stein also wanted to see Grid's master's items, so he asked Grid to show them. For his part, Grid was reluctant to show them but asked what price defensive items of level 120 usually had. Stein was disappointed that he couldn't satisfy his curiosity but revealed that normal grade items cost about 300 gold coins. Then, Grid asked about epic grade items, and Stein's curiosity was sparked again. He asked excitedly if the master forged epic grade items. Stein revealed that epic gauntlets usually sold for 600, while armor of that level could be sold for 1,800 gold coins. After deducting the costs of materials and the week he spent at that capsule hotel, he would still make a profit of over 2 million Korean wons. Grid was excited because he had debts of 10 million wons and could now pay them off. The young player was startled by the protagonist's expression but was warned that he was running out of time to set his prices. Grid did this as quickly as possible and prayed that a knight would buy them for a good price. Meanwhile, in the auction room, they presented the last item to be sold today. The buyers were disappointed that it was the last one, as there was nothing of value. Only the items had piqued their curiosity. The last item was an above-average sword forged by the blacksmith Radvan. This sword allowed magic to flow easily through it. The buyers were excited, as it was the best item they had seen so far, and began to bid, offering 1,000, 1,100, and 1,200 gold coins one after the other. Then, they informed the hostess that there were items that had been sent late. Later, he was awakened by the young blacksmith, as the results had already been published. The hostess began to inform about the auctions. A total of 100 items were auctioned, of which only 6 were sold. The blacksmiths were very sad, as there were few chances that their items would be on the list. The necklace of Miss Clarice was sold for 453 gold, Mr. Gress's inner armor for 189 gold, Piglet's potion for 15 gold, and the sword that Mr. Stein brought was sold for 1,900 gold coins. The young man was very happy, as his master would be very pleased to know this, but Grid was very jealous. He thought he had received a very good offer. The last item announced belonged to Grid. The protagonist stepped forward, and the hostess informed him that the auction administrator wanted to see him. Grid was confused, but Stein, who had more experience in auctions, was happy. "A big surprise awaits you," he said to the protagonist with a smile from ear to ear. Grid, in turn, wondered what kind of surprise awaited him. The hostess informed the administrator that Grid had arrived, who invited the protagonist to sit down while praising the fact that he had managed to copy Kan's work, calling him a heroic blacksmith. The stories about Grid had spread beyond. Winston, the administrator, praised the protagonist's skills and personality. "Kan trained you well," he exclaimed. Grid thought he achieved everything thanks to his skills, not Kan's. The administrator revealed that they would buy Grid's items for 5,500 gold coins, in addition to wanting the protagonist to provide equipment for the soldiers. Grid was stunned, as this amount would be almost 7 million Korean wons, or 73 days working at the employment office, and he achieved it in a week. However, there was a problem for Grid. His blacksmith shop was so busy that they didn't have time to prepare equipment for all those soldiers. Grid said that thanks to this auction, the protagonist now had clarity. Although it took more time, high-grade items earned him much more money than normal-grade ones. Therefore, he would refuse to equip simple soldiers. The administrator asks if he could only create equipment for the knights, reminding that they are the few guards with the highest rank. However, the items he brought would have to be equal to or better than those he brought to the auction. The administrator understood the difficulty of the mission, which is why he would also pay 10% more. It was a very complicated mission because, although he worked 20 hours to create an epic item, sometimes normal-grade items came out, and if he failed the mission, he would likely be penalized. No one in their right mind would accept, he thought. However, the protagonist seems to have changed his mind upon leaving the castle, as Grid accepted the proposal. "I need money, and I ended up accepting the deal," the protagonist cursed. According to the mission, Grid had to deliver 3 epic swords to Administrator Blatty within a week. Of the last 3 items Grid created, 2 were epic, so it wasn't impossible. Somehow, he would manage to deliver them in a week. Grid leaves the castle, not before remembering how happy the young blacksmith was with Grid's good news. "I couldn't say goodbye to him," thought the protagonist. Now it was time to celebrate, as Grid was now rich. In the previous episode, our protagonist managed to strike a deal with the auction administrator, so now he had to forge 3 epic items in less than a week. Recapping the situation in the city, Count Stein sought and destroyed all Yatten churches, as this group had kidnapped his daughter Irene, and during the rescue operation, they lost Oran, the strongest warrior of the Stein family. In the north of Winston, on a mission to eliminate the Yaten temples, everything seemed to be going well until a user appeared on the battlefield. It was Yura, the Blood Witch. There are too many of them. This might take longer than usual, thought the player. Apparently, she had to complete an SS-ranked mission. She had to save the Yaten believers from the attack of Stein's troops. As a reward, she would obtain the position of the 8th servant of the Yaten Church and some skills. Yura needed to complete the mission because upon encountering the 7th ranked in the unified ranking, Angus, she could only feel helpless against an epic class bearer. So, Yura attacks Stein's troops and launches herself directly against her enemies. She needed to get stronger to become the number 1 ranked. In the castle of Winston, they are counting the casualties. There were 412 victims, and 5 knights were seriously injured. The count's daughter was furious. The number of enemies was only 150. How could 1,000 soldiers and 8 knights have been defeated by their hands? The informant reveals that the reports highlight a very skilled opponent among the enemy ranks, probably one of the 7 main servants of the Yaten Church. Irene picks up the ring that hangs melancholically, remembering Doran. She definitely needed to avenge him, so she orders the subjugation group to be reorganized to strengthen it, returning to the protagonist. We see that his last creation is a normal grade sword. Elder Kan was surprised. Among the normal category swords, it should be one of the best. This comment further irritated Grid, as the weapon remained normal category. With the money Grid had, he could only buy materials to forge 7 swords and had just ruined one. He needed to forge 3 epic swords. Therefore, now he needed to forge 1 epic sword for every 2 swords he forged. Elderkin reassures Grid, saying that if he sold this sword, he could get 800 gold coins. But Grid responds that the material cost 950 coins. Then, Grid gets excited again. You are spending all your energy and more than 20 hours to create just one object. Hard work will never betray you, he replied, starting to work on the next weapon. A day later, Grid reviewed the statistics of his second sword, which turned out to be normal grade again. Ken proposes to sell it for 800 gold coins, but Grid calls the old man a scammer. Grid leaves the forge and shouts as loud as he can, "Hey great developers! Stop manipulating my possibilities or I will request a customer service test." Grid sends the title of legendary blacksmith to hell, as he now only had 5 opportunities, but he had to work on the next weapon, which obtained the rare classification. The protagonist needed to focus, but even his sister noticed that Grid was not resting well. The 4th sword was normal grade, disappointing the protagonist. However, Grid would finish forging all the swords. A week later, Elderkin observes the protagonist's creations. 2 epic weapons, 1 rare, and 3 normal. You just need 1 epic. But this is still a great achievement, Ken said to ease the situation. Grid was working on his last sword. The elder asks if he is okay, to which Grid responds affirmatively, as he has already accepted his misfortune. The elder wondered how Pagma's descendant could act so weakly and feebly, to which Grid questions the existence of Pagma. This was his last blade. For Grid, the chances of making an epic weapon were null, but at least he could rest. So, he proceeds to join the parts. This began to emit a very strange glow. It was the first time a created object had this reaction. A lightning bolt blessed the sword, and Grid wondered what the hell was happening. But upon reviewing the sword, it was the first legendary grade sword the protagonist had created. It had the title of Self-Transcendent Sword, with over 350 attack power, and among its characteristics, it granted additional damage according to the opponent's level, the perfect state ability of self-transcendence. All the protagonist's statistics increased for creating a legendary object, and he gained 1,000 reputation throughout the continent. Additionally, he earned the title of creator of only legendary objects. The situation took a 180-degree turn for our unfortunate protagonist. It was the first time he created a legendary weapon, but when he turned to see Elder Khan, he started foaming at the mouth and fainted. "Don't die, old man," shouted Grid. In the castle of Winston, they inform Lady Irene that the second subjugation group was defeated. According to the data they had collected, it must have been the fault of one of the 7 main servants of Yaten. Therefore, the subjugation of the enemies depended exclusively on being able to defeat such an adversary. Thus, they would wait for reinforcements before making any move. Although it would take longer, Irene was willing to avenge her old friend Doran. Then she notices something out the window. What is that guy doing? It seems to be our protagonist, who is looting sources to find coins. A gold coin. It's the first time I've found money, exclaimed Grid. Then, the auction administrator enters Lady Winston's room. Lady Irene, are you present? Just in time, administrator. There is a strange user in the garden. The administrator spared the explanations. I see you have already realized. You must meet with that man as soon as possible. Lady Irene is called Grid. Irene seems to recognize this name. Grid? She asked, confused. In the sitting room, Mrs. Winston receives the protagonist. The administrator explains that Grid was tasked with creating swords for the Knights of Winston after the auction. Moreover, he was also the hero who saved the people from the tyranny of the Marrow Company. Irene is delighted. The blacksmith of the rumors had planned to meet with you, but many circumstances took my time. Grid, for his part, was only thinking of one thing. Just give me my reward. But where have I seen this woman before, he wondered. Then, the administrator introduces Irene, one of the swords that the protagonist produced. Upon unveiling it, Mrs. Winston is surprised. What a remarkable weapon is this? Grid proposes to start negotiations, recalling that he would pay more the better the weapons he brought. It was a magnificent sword. Then he asks one of his knights, if I wield this sword, could I rival one of Yatin's 7 servants? The knight quickly replies, if I wield this sword, I can face them, but I cannot defeat them, he corrected himself. Then, Irene turns to the protagonist. Very well, then there is no reason to doubt, administrator, by this sword. And pointing to Grid, she allows him to choose the price and proposes that they meet more often. Grid notices something. Where have I seen that ring before? He liked the new ruler of Winston. She was flexible and open-minded. Grid is in the waiting room. The administrator apologizes for making him wait, but Grid urges him, please, be quicker. I'm tired of hammering. The administrator apologizes again. I understand. You should have concentrated all your energy and mind to create such a beautiful and majestic work. Grid threatens him. Don't try to fool me. The administrator offers 220,000 gold. The protagonist thought 220 gold was little, but the administrator corrects. 220,000. They were willing to make this weapon a relic for the Stein family. Grid was blank. The administrator thought he might have offered too little, but he couldn't give more, as Winston's annual budget was 170,000 gold. Grid, for his part, was crying with happiness. In exchange, it was almost $4 million. More than 250 million Korean wons would remain after paying his debt. If he sold it online to other players, they would even pay much more, but there weren't many players who met the requirements to use it, so he needed to sell it now. Now he could attend his schoolmates' meetings dressed in luxury clothes and in foreign cars. He was willing to confess his feelings again to his crush. Grid agreed to sell the weapon at that price. Then, the administrator offers him a gift as a token of gratitude. Grid did not know what it was, but the administrator reveals that it is a strange mineral called blue orichalcum. Grid remembers that it was the mineral needed to craft the failure. He needed 15 of these mineral orbs, so today was his lucky day. The administrator was happy to have successfully closed the transaction. Grid completed his mission, obtaining 234,000 gold and 3 pieces of blue orichalcum, earning the title of Distinguished Person of Winston. With this title, he had been recognized by the ruler, so his products were recognized as high quality and were exempt from taxes. Grid celebrated success after success, thanked for everything, and logged off. He couldn't wait to tell everyone at home. Grid ran home, excited. He was a rich man now. However, Grid could have gotten much more for such an extraordinary weapon, as several users could achieve advanced mastery of the sword, being able to use it, and considering the stock of legendary weapons in the market, he could have sold it for billions of Korean wons without a problem. However, this event was the beginning of a new life for Grid. He arrived home as quickly as possible, with good news for his family, but felt an atmosphere of discouragement at home. Grid asked if something was wrong, as everyone seemed sadder than usual. Then, his sister revealed that the guarantee for the loan his father signed was 800 million Korean wons. Later, the father asked Grid not to worry. If they sold the house and used the saved money, they could pay 400 million Korean wons. The father did not know how else he could apologize to correct his mistake. Grid was very worried about his father. They apologized to their daughter, as they would now have to use the money they had saved for her university and wedding. Wait a moment, had they saved nothing for Grid? Were all the savings for his sister? Grid asked worriedly. Am I not part of this family? Then, the sister explained that she did not need to go to university and would help pay off the debt with a part-time job. The parents asked their daughter not to go that far. They were very proud of her. Grid, for his part, saw that it was unfair to his sister. She had always had the best grades and was about to waste all her effort. Then Grid raised his voice. Well, I will earn money so that you can continue studying. The parents did not understand what had happened to their son. Then, the father would also look for another job the next day. The mother also proposed to work in a restaurant, so the whole family would strive to pay off the debt. It seemed they did not take Grid seriously, so he revealed that he made 200 million in a game. The parents were stunned by these numbers. Grid was willing to save his family. It was the first time he felt a responsibility to fulfill. Meanwhile, in Satisfy, the governor of Winston hands Grid's legendary sword to the knight Ser Phoenix so that he can punish Yaten's servants. The knight agrees to defend the glory of the Stein family. Irene orders them to bring back the head of one of Yaten's 7 main servants. Although the enemy was made up of only 150 soldiers, they could not let their guard down, as they had a main servant in their ranks. Therefore, they would go all out. 12 knights and 100 soldiers had to emerge victorious at all costs. Ser Phoenix led the allied troops as the strongest knight in northern Winston. From the perspective of Yaten's followers, they were nothing more than other sacrifices for their god. They would support Yura as best they could. Yura knew that in this church, and especially the 7 servants, they were rotten to the core with evil. She regretted accepting the mission, but unless she obtained a hidden class like Katz or Angus, she couldn't do anything else. Yura charged directly at the enemies. The knight was surprised by her decision. Finally, one of the 7 servants appeared. They were supposed to end this here. Yura didn't like being associated with the wicked followers of Yaten, but her actions couldn't be less dishonorable. Then, the player began to cast a spell. The sky started to darken. Yura had the mission to protect the followers of Yaten and launched an attack that should take out a quarter of the enemy soldiers. However, the Phoenix Knight charged directly into the enemy front. Yura was very surprised. Impossible. The enemy leader was able to block my Black Storm? The witch went on the defensive and activated a diamond barrier. The intimidating knight did not back down and activated the perfect state of self-transcendence of the sword, destroying the defense with a single blow. Yura didn't know how to react, as her defense could withstand monster bosses without issue. It didn't make sense. Then, Yura used the Inferno skill, which instilled a state of fear in the opponent, but it seemed useless against the knight, as the only one affected was the horse. Yura was worried. How did it have no effect on him? Here the manual reveals to us that the perfect state of self-transcendence increased all statistics by 200% for 2 minutes and the user became resistant to negative effects. However, upon activating the skill, the bearer could not control themselves and would be immobilized with reduced defenses for 2 seconds. Yura had felt this feeling of helplessness before. An image came to her mind. Grid. Then, the knight struck. The player had only one way out. A few days ago, Yura obtained 100,000 faith points and heard Yaten's voice. If she prayed, Yura would gain a new power. She needed power, a power to deal with those who were not affected by black magic. And then, Yura unleashed a great power, returning to the protagonist. The parents were very surprised that their son was not lying. The father asked if he hadn't done anything illegal, while the mother hypothesized that it was a fake account. The sister, in turn, thought that Grid had sold his organs, so she lifted his shirt to confirm that her brother was whole. Grid understood his situation, as no parent would believe that their 26-year-old unemployed son could earn such a sum of money legally. But Grid swore to them that he earned it cleanly and legally in a game, and allowed them to use it without problems. In fact, the protagonist got rid of all his equipment, and upon removing it, they charged 13 million yuns in taxes. The mother was surprised. I asked a friend, and she told me that to earn that much money, you have to be very famous. The sister heard that there were fewer than 20 people who earned that much from games in Korea. The father revealed that, from his position as a father, he had only been reprimanding him for playing. This money only meant that Grid must have been working very hard, so he approved of Grid spending all day playing. Finally, he was recognized. The father thanked Grid. Thanks to you, We can overcome this crisis, so do what you have to do." The parents were willing to repay the debt over the next 3 years. The father was eternally grateful and apologized for having to depend on him. From now on, the parents would work and strive, as the burden was too heavy for them, since they still had to repay 600 million Korean yuns. Grid expressed that there was no debt between family and that this time it was his turn to help the family. Grid would continue to work to pay off the debts for some time, but he liked the idea of being able to help his loved ones. Grid returned to the world of Satisfy. The protagonist was determined to do his best from now on. He saved 20,000 gold coins to continue producing, but he had to be careful, as if he produced a normal grade item with very high usage requirements, he wouldn't be able to sell it. He had to produce level 140 items to balance the creation price and the selling price. Other people in the village talked about another subjugation group that had been defeated again by the Yatan Church. Even the strongest knight of the north, Sir Phoenix, had been severely injured. The 7 servants were too powerful. Grid had heard about the 7 servants among the customers at the blacksmith. Grid wondered if they were really that strong. As he opened his status window, it seemed that his statistics had improved a lot from having been crafting so much lately. Even at level 45, he could hunt level 100 monsters without problems if he took his equipment. Grid would have liked to go out to hunt monsters as he used to in the past, but he had to work to pay off his debt. Once at Khan's blacksmith, Grid was working at his forge when the elder arrived. "You came early to work today," the old man mentioned. Grid revealed that from now on he would strive to work more seriously. Khan praised the protagonist's forging techniques and asked what he was working on this time. On this occasion, Grid was creating a forging hammer, as the one he had been using for the past few days had nearly reduced its durability to the minimum. This was a big change. The elder thought that the hammer Grid had been using was important to him, as it was the only one he used, but the protagonist revealed that it had no sentimental value, it was just the only hammer he had. The elder was moved. The hammer is the most important tool of a blacksmith. He thought that Grid would know this, being a descendant of Pagma, and showed him his hammer. Grid used appraisal to see the statistics of the tool. It was a rare grade hammer that increased the chance of creating rare items by 10%. Upon evaluating it, Grid understood the materials and production methods of the excellent blacksmith hammer. The elder expressed that with a good hammer, he wouldn't have had so many problems. Grid shouted in confusion, "Why didn't you tell me before?" Upon finishing the production of his hammer, we see that the protagonist created the unknown master blacksmith's hammer, which increased the chance of creating rare items by 17% and epic items by 7%. The only requirement to use it was to be a descendant of Pagma. Grid created a hammer that only he could use. The elder thought that Grid would never cease to amaze him. The elder had a request for Grid, but the protagonist seemed to still be angry. The old man revealed that today was the anniversary of his son's death and asked Grid if he would like to accompany him to visit the grave. This request caught Grid by surprise. In a beautiful setting, Grid and the elder arrived at the cemetery. It was uncomfortable for the protagonist. Elder Khan was one of the few people who accepted him as he was, so he would listen to his request. This is the cemetery of Elder Khan's ancestors, and they were in front of the tombstone of his son, Oliver. The elder described him as a great blacksmith. If he had been alive, he could have reached the same heights as his ancestor, Sir Bettino, but an illness did not allow it. 10 years had passed, but the elder still missed him every day. He thought he would like to dedicate his life to his son. Then, the elder asked his son if he could recognize the protagonist. "He is the descendant of Pagma, the blacksmith of whom you always asked me to tell you stories." "Are you surprised?" he asked his son. He said he was grateful to work with him and that he was also the savior of the blacksmith. He mentioned that he also quit drinking. Then, the elder began to talk to himself. This surprised the protagonist, and the elder turned around. "My son says he is very jealous of me. Thank God I brought you with me today." This brought out the more sentimental side of the protagonist, and he took a step forward. "Sir Oliver, your father is a dear friend of mine, so I will return to your beloved blacksmith, the best of all." Therefore, he asked him to continue watching over him from heaven. The elder could not help but shed a few tears. At that moment, the bond between Khan and the protagonist strengthened, and the tombstones began to glow. The souls of KH's ancestors were moved by the affection shown towards the elder. Grid called the elder to see, but he had fallen asleep. The souls presented themselves. "Nice to meet you. descendant of Pagma and friend of our descendant. They were the ancestors of Khan and wanted to reward Grid for his sincerity. A reward? Asked the protagonist. 130 years ago, I witnessed the admirable beauty that pierced the heavens. What the hell is the ancestor talking about? He continued. I was so fascinated that I could not hide my emotion. Therefore, to properly record it, I drew the scene from my memories on the northern cliff of the Kezan Gorge. There you will find Pagma's swordsmanship. Then, Pagma's descendant mission updated. Grid had to head to the gorge to learn Pagma's swordsmanship, and as rewards, he would obtain the Sword of Ensleeve. Now he remembered. It was a mission that appeared to him upon meeting the Elder. The ancestor told the protagonist that the drawing would help him learn Pagma's swordsmanship. They hoped that Grid would surpass even Pagma and finally left Grid in the care of his father. The protagonist accepted so that the ancestors could rest in peace. Later, when the Elder woke up from his nap, he asked the protagonist when he had fallen asleep. Grid replied that old people shouldn't fall asleep anywhere. From now on, he asked him to be more careful. The Elder asked the protagonist why he was standing there like that, to which Grid asked him not to mind. At the entrance of Khan's blacksmith, we see Uroi. He wonders what he should do. Will he be happy to see me? Maybe he'll ask why I came to see him so late. It had been 40 days since Uroi completed the mission of waiting for 30 hours online. The boy spent a week in the hospital to recover and took another week to decide whether or not to reveal his name as the first user of 2 classes. Therefore, he returned to play Satisfy only 3 days ago and was finally visiting Khan's blacksmith to serve the one he promised to follow, who was coming out the door. The adventurer was moved to see the protagonist and knelt to introduce himself. Uroi? Asked Grid. The boy was excited and thrilled to be remembered, but Grid grabbed him firmly. At that moment, Grid was irritated with the boy, as he thought they lost the forging competition because of him. Uroi, not fully understanding the situation, apologized and continued to call him my lord. Grid found this way of addressing him strange and thought that perhaps he had gone crazy from waiting so long. Then, Grid let the matter slide and told him to go away. Uroi asked where he would go. The boy revealed that he would follow Grid because he swore to do so. Moreover, his titles of Apostle of Justice and Companion of the Apostle of Justice should be together. Grid thought that the boy was definitely crazy. Uroi proposed to join Grid's guild, but he wasn't in any, so Uroi suggested that he create one. Stop bothering me and go your way, said Grid. The protagonist was very busy creating items for his class mission. Guys, if you don't want to miss the next releases, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It's very important for us, in addition to the comments, which generate engagement for the channel. I look forward to seeing you in the next Nerd Recap.